I got married fairly late. I was only 34 when I got married.
Wow.
But I caught up very quickly because I got 5 kids in short order. The Cape is beautiful, but there's something about the southern Drakensberg that captures me, and I just love that part of the country. And I actually took a friend of mine who was actually at that stage doing security work in Iraq. He was a former special forces guy from the Recce's. He said, look, I've never interacted with Muslims, and I hear you're going to do that. I want to get some sense of what these people believe. And next time you vote, don't be so worried about the pothole in the front of your house. Take a little concern for what your child might be taught in our institutions. And so what we've got to do now is challenge our black Christian brothers and sisters. And I would challenge any African people out there. Say, look, if we're to talk about the future of this nation and come up with a philosophy by which to govern ourselves, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that this stuff here is African.
This episode of the In HeinzSight BoldCast is brought to you by addpay.
Simon Brace, you are in Cape Town and we're getting to hang together. Welcome to the In HeinzSight BoldCast.
Yeah, well, hey, look, it's great to be here with you. It's just a privilege. I'm down here for a bit of work. So I've left my lovely wife and my kids back in Potch, up in Potchefstroom, and I'm down here to come and do some work. But it is good that we get some time together this morning. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. We're going to have a great conversation. I love to just, for everyone listening to get to know you a little bit better. And then we're going to dive into some really interesting stuff. You've brought some really cool books and we're going to have an awesome time.
Yes.
So, just quickly, I was reading your biography, impressive background. But you are actually originally from Zim, right?
That's correct, yes.
Yes.
In a few years ago, we were called Wenwees. We always talk about when we were in when we were in Zimbabwe. But I'm of Zimbabwean stock. My folks actually were born in Zambia, and then they moved down to what was then Rhodesia, and so I was born during the Rhodesian Civil War, but we left after independence, and I actually grew up in KZN.
Oh, wow.
Midlands. I love the Midlands. The Midlands is the Shire of the world. I know people love the Cape.
It's beautiful there.
It is so beautiful there. It's the southern Drakensberg is. I love that the Cape is beautiful.
Yeah.
But there's something about the southern Drakensberg that captures me, and I just love that part of the country. And I like Potch, but if I could choose where I wanted to live, it might be in the Midlands. I do like that
I
part
hear
of the
you,
country,
bro.
yes.
And that is where you are situated now, is Potchefstroom. You're working on campus, your wife as well.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So it's an interesting story how we ended up. One would wonder, how does an Englishman, or they call me Die Engelsman in Potch, It's a very Afrikaans town, and so I'm there. But that's a story of the Lord just working in our lives and why we ended up there, and we are very happy there. Potchefstroom is just an amazing town, and if you're not moving to Mossel Bay, move to Potch, because we just have an amazing community of people there. It's not without its challenges, and we all have, but the greatest thing about Potchefstroom is the families there, and it's just a rich place for just good, wholesome family life. We're living life together with mums and dads and a whole army of children. It's just
beautiful.
So much fun. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. You yourself have a small army of kids and a beautiful wife. Tell us quickly about Nell and the 4 children.
Okay, so I left South Africa after high school and my studies in KZN and ended up in the UK. And actually, I met my wife doing evangelism to Muslims at Speaker's Corner in London.
Wow.
And so this beautiful Afrikaans girl captivated my mind and my heart, and we got married. We both have a shared interest in sharing the gospel with Muslims. And but then we also had an interest in studying theology and these kinds of things, and so we ended up as students together.
I just need to stop you there for a second. I mean, that's a very specific thing to have in common. Ministering the gospel to Muslims and then theology and stuff. I mean, that. Yeah. Was there a moment in life where you thought, will I ever find someone like that?
There was actually, because I got married fairly late. I was only 34 when I got married.
Wow.
But I caught up very quickly because I got 5 kids in short order. So I caught
5 kids. Sorry, I made a mistake. You've got 5. Yes.
I've got 5. Yes. Yeah. So I caught up to all my friends rather quickly. Yes. So
this episode of the In HeinzSight BoldCast is brought to you by addpay, a values-led fintech company committed to building with purpose. At addpay, we believe business is a calling, a platform to serve people with excellence, innovation, and integrity. We offer smart, scalable payment solutions that empower merchants, simplify transactions, and unlock financial inclusion across Africa. Our foundation is built on Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. That means we lead with faith, steward our business with accountability, and trust God as the ultimate provider. We are builders, not just of platforms and partnerships, but of something greater. We believe that when we honor him in how we work, lead, and grow, the impact reaches far beyond the bottom line. addpay, powering commerce with purpose, building for the kingdom.
How close are your kids together in age?
They're 2 years apart, and conveniently for me, everything's an odd year and everything. So this year we're going to our even years. So it's Eva 16, Olivia 14, Kai 12, Giannis 10, and Ruben 8. And so that makes it easy for me.
Yeah.
Now some of those were planned, and some of those children were passion. Yeah, they were passion children. Yes.
In the moment children.
Yes.
We had the strangest conversation with our kids the other day, because my 3 boys are now of that age where they're starting to know things and realize things and putting the dots together. And so they had the question, where was I made?
Yes.
So now it's this thing of like, wow, how awkward can this become? What shall we share?
Yes.
But it's actually quite amazing, because there's something about them asking those questions. It's part of them knowing where they belong.
For sure. Yeah, you're part of this clan, and this is how things came along. And no, look, I'm in awe of what Jesus has done in my life, and where he's brought me from, and just I'm blessed with an amazing wife and just children, and I'm just so grateful for what he's done in my life and with my wife and my kids. Yeah, I'm just very blessed.
Please share with me your personal testimony. What was your come to Jesus moment?
So I started high school in Pietermaritzburg. I went to a small primary school for the most part near Greytown, a small town called Kranskop. It's out near the Tugela River.
Okay.
Just on the other side of Angus Buchan's farm there. Okay. So I grew up in that whole. That part of the Midlands has got all the Germans in it, Hermansburg and Wartburg and Harburg and all of that kind of.
All right.
Part of the Midlands, and so we grew up there. My dad worked in the forestry industry, but when I went to high school, I was at boarding school, and I joined the SCA, and older people might remember, Student Christian Association.
Yes.
And so I became a Christian. I remember giving my life to the Lord when I was about 13 years old. I went to an event, and the gospel was preached, and I thought, well, this is true of me. I've got sin in my life, and so it was a simple gospel message, and I thought, this is true. I have an overinflated view of myself. I'm guilty of that, and I'm in trouble. And so I responded to the gospel message. And for the most part, I was a pretty dedicated Christian at high school, insofar as a high school boy can be. I was pretty dedicated to my faith and would go to SCA, and that. I didn't have my problems. Of course, we were going through things. But when I left high school and I went off to go and study at Durban Tech, that's where the wheels fell off. And I ended up in a pretty rough crowd of guys, and it was the usual wine, woman, and song. And I became the prodigal son.
Wow.
And I went on a journey of that for a few years. I graduated in 1995, and so in 1996 I went overseas because the changes in South Africa were huge. Affirmative action policies were kicking in, and so if you're a young white guy, finding a job was tough.
Yeah.
So I threw you throw your things out to the ocean, you float your things out there. I went overseas, and like a lot of people back then, and that's where I started working. And I just ended up in more crises. I ended up living with a girl in Scotland and cohabiting, but I never became a skeptic or an atheist or agnostic.
Okay.
I would do what a lot of people do. I would pray when things were a crisis, or I would have moments when I remembered the Lord, and He never really left me along the way.
If I may, just sorry for interrupting you, but I think there's an important moment that you described that I think many people who grow up in a Christian environment, whether it be at home or at school, when they go, as you said, to college or university or some kind of place where they're now alone and they're not surrounded by what they used to be surrounded by, can you, looking back, can you articulate, what was the shift from I went to SCA, I was a good Christian boy,
yes,
and then something shifted, and I went on the wrong path. What for you, looking back, were the main reasons that had happened? Because this might help a young person that's listening and going, on with their lives. They love Jesus, they want to do the right thing, but what are the warning signs to look out for? What are the things that happen in your life, do you think?
Well, for me, it was inevitably peer pressure that ultimately made me kind of capitulate on my Christian convictions.
So wrong friends? Or this the wrong crowd around you?
just the wrong crowd. And of course, I'm still friends with a lot of these guys now. I've kept in touch with them, so I haven't abandoned them completely. But they kind of know where I stand at the moment, and I love them. And if I get a chance, I'll share the gospel with them. And we didn't completely break ties, but it was me caving into some of those things, which I knew inside was not the way to conduct myself. And so
would you say the sense of I need to belong to this group, so I need to go along with this, was much stronger pull than the truth of the gospel or the revelation of Jesus? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so that was the good life, or the having fun. And I had a kind of an existential moment outside of a nightclub in the streets of Durban one evening when I had got, unfortunately, I was intoxicated, and I remember sitting on the curb there, and I had caused a big fight between my friends, and I thought to myself, gosh, this is not a very high hill. I thought this was meant to be fun, and this is not fun. Yeah. And so, but that wasn't enough to shift me. I was a bit iron forehead kind of thing, and it took a few more. It took me to hit a few more serious potholes. Wow! And the Lord, but he was always there. I was always cognizant of Him there. And then
I know what you mean.
Yeah. And then eventually, I got to a position where I just said, look, I traveled extensively across the world, and so I'd gotten to see a lot of things. And I realized that it didn't matter where I found myself in the different places. I lived in Australia. I traveled to New Zealand. I'd been into Siberia, to Russia. I'd done cool things. I'd done all the things that some guys want to do. I'd been fly fishing.
Bucket list stuff.
Yeah, skiing in the Alps, fly fishing in South America.
Very cool.
I worked in the Philippines, and so I'd seen a lot. And the one thing that occurred to me was, the Lord kept showing me. He said to him, how are these people any different? Notice this, that it doesn't matter whether they're wealthy or they're poor, they're all broken. Sure. Their relationships are fractured. And
maybe even on the outside, initially it looks like, oh, these guys have a great life. But then when you get to know them or see the cracks, or
that's what God began to show me. And then I realized, no, Jesus has diagnosed mankind. And He's diagnosed me. He's read my book.
He nailed it.
He nailed it. And there needs to be a reckoning here. And I came crawling back to the church, and I was actually invited back to the church by some good friends of mine that I knew from South Africa, but it was at a church in London. And that's when I kind of rededicated my life to the Lord and said a few prayers, which really, which God honored in some way. And so in some sense, that's the reason why I'm sitting in front of you now, because I knew I needed to take the scriptures a bit more seriously than I had in the past. And so I asked Him, I said, Lord, could you just give me a desire to read the Word? And man, I got a desire to read like nothing else. And so I just started reading the Bible and reading other stuff. I never was much of a reader.
Okay.
And then
which is interesting, because you became quite the academic.
Yeah, and so it's really odd then, because I could never foresee that I would be doing the very thing I'm doing now. I couldn't speak in front of people, but that's what I do almost for a living now. That's what my life is about. And so, the Lord just worked in a gracious and patient way with me through all of this and through all my difficulties. And but man, he did a number on me. And in London, I just met wonderful people. I was very fortunate that along my journey, God put people there who were the right mentors at the right time.
Wow.
And then, of course, he also then blessed me with my amazing wife. And I confess, I prayed for a beautiful wife and for Lord. At some stage, when you're 34, you're wondering whether the Lord has got that prayer, whether maybe that didn't fall off the bus somewhere. Because I was beginning, man, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth here now. My hair's beginning to fall out now. I don't quite look as handsome maybe as I used to think I looked. Maybe I didn't look handsome in the first place. But you have those thoughts,
of course,
and you're thinking, well, maybe I'm just going to be one of those guys who just follows. If that's the case, but
be like a Paul.
Oh. Yeah. But when you have that crisis, though, and it's often when you stop the anxiety of the looking and you just hand it over to the Lord, that all of a sudden this happened. And then, man, I married up big time. My wife, if you ever come to my house, the person you want to meet is my wife. She's amazing. And I think you're in the same kind of boat. I've met your wife.
I've definitely married up as well. Yeah. Yes, but don't tell her that.
Okay. Yes.
No, I'm kidding. Yes, we are blessed and very, 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 very lucky that they even looked at us, I guess.
Yes.
But your wife is amazing. But brother, I mean, I have so much respect for you as well. And the fact that I think there's so much blessing in obedience and waiting on God's timing for things like your marriage partner.
Yes.
One of the things I feel so passionate about and is for, especially for young Christian people, to understand that God's timing is not the same as the world's timing. And
for sure,
even if you were to wait till 34, the social pressure, move that aside.
Yes.
Lord, what do you want?
For sure.
Lord, I'd love to have my wife, this way, and you wait, and it happened for you, which is amazing. And I mean, back to that question I asked, so specific. She was doing evangelism among Muslims, which is so incredible. And you were like, what was that moment for you like? Did you just know immediately, or was it like God was working in your heart?
It's this odd thing. We were in this basement in a church in London called All Souls Church with a Christian outreach organization to Muslims. And I actually took a friend of mine who was actually at that stage doing security work in Iraq. He was a former special forces guy from the Recce's.
Wow.
And he said, look, I've never interacted with Muslims, and I hear you're going to do that. I want to get some sense of what these people believe. And I said, well, come along, meet with me, because at Speaker's Corner, you're going to meet some pretty radical Muslims, and some of the guys that you're going to be up against, they have these convictions. So you can certainly learn something from that. And I remember sitting over there, and this friend of mine asked a question, and of course Nell, being Afrikaans, she picked up the accent. And so she walked across the room towards us, and she introduced herself. And I thought to myself, wow, this is an attractive South African girl. And little did I know that girl who came across there would become my wife.
Wow.
But that's where our friendship began.
Beautiful.
And through that ministry, we became good friends. And then we became really good friends. And then we became really, really good friends. And then we got married and we had 5 kids.
Come on.
So yeah, it was just a tremendous blessing in my life. And so I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for that.
I love it. Great story.
Yes.
So today you are the director of Rasho Christi, and you run the national director.
Yes, I am now we've just actually appointed a new national director, because the ministry is growing now.
Okay.
So I'm kind of having to kind of move myself into a different position, because the ministry is growing well in South Africa, but there's a call on the international front as well. We've got interest elsewhere. So I'm trying to put somebody in my former position, which is giving oversight to the South African chapters, and I'm trying to focus on our outreach to local churches and our partners, but also because of my experience, I'm also trying to help our other international interests that are spawning all over the world now as well. But
well, that's exciting.
It is.
Okay,
yes.
but you helped started Ratio Christi. Just quickly tell us, what is Ratio Christi and what do you focus on? And you've been running the chapter in Potch for a long time.
That's correct. Yeah. So when I was in America, when I decided to leave my career in construction, I was qualified as a land surveyor. So I did a lot of engineering surveying, setting out structures and this kind of thing. And when I sensed that God wanted me to move out of that and go and get some training formally, and I was looking for a theological institution that combined biblical studies with the discipline of defending the faith, apologetics.
What made you look for that specifically?
Because I think through my work with Muslims, when you get into proper conversations with Muslims about the things that matter, almost without failure, even if you're speaking to a more nominal Muslim, they're going to come up with objections. They're going to come up with objections with respect to the deity of Jesus, the Trinity, and the reliability of the Bible. And once those cards are played,
the three main things.
You're then in an apologetic kind of conversation.
Okay.
And so I was living in London, and Europe for the most part people there for the most part are skeptics. They're philosophical skeptics of one stripe or another. And so Christianity as a vibrant faith system is long since dead in Europe for the most part. And I can say that with some conviction because I lived there for 10 years.
It's sad to see because at one point it was the flourishing where it came from and was sending out to the world. Yeah.
For sure. And so you're dealing with all of these kinds of objections. And through that, I thought to myself, look, if you're going to try and make headway into the culture, certainly when I was in Europe then, and then it turns out that's the case in a lot of the world, you've got to be prepared not only to proclaim the gospel, but you have to be ready to defend the gospel. Okay? Wow. And of course, when you look in the scriptures, you actually see that this is actually a mandate from the scriptures.
Yeah.
You know, for example, in Titus 1:9, which is a scripture directed towards elders, it has a very specific designation of the responsibility of an elder, that is to encourage people through sound doctrine and to refute those who oppose.
Yes.
And that refutation there is the apologetic task. And we see Paul doing this. And Paul in Philippians 1 talks about him, that we all partake of the grace of Christ, but that he says that we share with him in his defense and proclamation of the gospel.
So that's powerful.
It's very powerful. I mean, I can't read Philippians too much because it breaks me.
Wow.
I have to stay away from the book of Philippians because I'm so convicted by that book. I love that book, but it's dangerous for me to read. It just humbles me so much. Yeah.
Last year we did a series on the book of Acts, and I was so blown away by that scene where Paul goes into Ephesus and he goes into what was their place of having arguments, and you know, the philosophers are asking questions, and they're like, oh, this is new and interesting, and he was basically laying out the case for Christ, you know, in the ancient world.
That's right.
For all these years to hear, and it was just incredible to see his boldness and his passion for the gospel, but also understanding that, listen, I need to make a case.
For sure. And Apollos is doing the same thing.
Yeah.
In fact, Apollos is actually he was from North Africa. We know that he's from Alexandria.
Yes.
And he was an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures. And we know from 1st and 2nd Corinthians that Paul wasn't. So Paul was much more compelling in his writing, but he wasn't we know that
in person. He wasn't that impressive.
So it's interesting to see that revealed. If you carefully read the New Testament, you see that then. We think somehow that Paul was this commanding figure, but he wasn't. But what Paul was good at was he could make disciples, man. And when he's in Ephesus now, and he trains those 12, and the whole of Asia Minor is turned upside down, I go, wow. Imagine if we could, maybe here in the Cape, we could make 12 meaningful disciples now. Yeah.
I remember being blown away by that part in Acts, where it says that because of the work of Paul, for the 3 years he was in Ephesus, there wasn't one person in the whole of Asia Minor who did not hear the gospel.
That's correct, yes. It's inspiring.
That is amazing.
Amazing, yeah. So
wow.
It was these verses. It was the book of Acts. It was reading through it and seeing Paul and others engage the philosophies and the worldviews of their times, thinking to myself, we need to do the same now. We need to understand something of the philosophies that govern our culture, and we need to demonstrate some knowledge of them, not because I necessarily am convinced of those things, but because if I really want to reach people with the gospel in an effective way, I sometimes need to understand the ideas that have gripped them. And we see Paul demonstrating this. In fact, in Acts 17, he shows very, very clearly that he knows something of the philosophy of the Stoic and the Epicurean philosophers.
Yeah, because he knows their writings. Yeah, because he grew up Greek.
Yes, he actually grows up in a non-Jewish town. He grows up in Tarsus, so he's familiar with their religion and their belief systems. Yeah. And he even quotes from their poets, which demonstrates that he knows something of their philosophy. And I think that is a good model for us to follow, and good principles there as a church for us to be well versed in the scripture. That's kind of our core. We need to, at minimum, know our own beliefs and why we believe them. But
one would hope.
One would hope, yes. It's good, and we want to encourage the brothers and sisters to do that. And then the next thing we can do then, when we've got some foundation there, is to try and understand what these ideas are that are gripping young people in our times, or even older people for that matter. What is the core to that, and what are the kinds of meaningful questions that we can ask them? So what we're trying to do is to ask good questions, understand, find some kind of common ground, if there is common ground, and if we see that there's a problem there, then we need to ask an honest question. And sometimes that's not an easy thing to do, and there can be contention there, but we've got to have the courage to speak the truth in love. And that's where the 2 Corinthians comes in with taking ideas captive. That's a description on spiritual warfare to some extent there.
Yeah. I'm glad you're mentioning that, because you are officially trained in philosophy and in apologetics. You've got a master's degree, and you also have a bachelor's in theology, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I don't know what else you have, man. It sounds like you've got a lot of academics behind you. And you also teach this stuff, or you have taught this to others, I'm assuming.
Yes, so that's how when I went to the seminary in the US, my background is originally in kind of surveying and engineering surveying. So it was a big shift from kind of construction work to
it's not a big shift. That's a massive shift.
To theology and philosophy. And actually out of that, at the seminary where I was studying these things and learning these things, that we were reaching out, and the seminary approached us to set up a missions program at the school. And then out of that missions program, coming back to your question of how did Ratio Christi start, we pick up that thread again. That's how Ratio Christi began, is because we were reaching out to local churches. The seminary I was in was Southern Evangelical Seminary in North Carolina. And we were reaching out to local universities. And through conversations we were having with students on campus, the students approached us and said, look, we need an organization that doesn't pay lip service to defending the faith. It's one thing us having our devotionals, it's one thing us encouraging one another and having fellowship. But the moment we seek to engage the unbeliever, things were not going well. And they weren't able to deal with a lot of the objections that were being leveled against the Christian faith.
That's pretty cool that students would say, hey, we want to do this, first of all. Secondly, we don't know how. Please help us. That's huge.
Yeah. So they came to us, and in my naivety, I thought, okay, well, this makes perfect sense. Let's do this. And little did I realize we had caught a dragon by the tail.
Oh, really?
And then this thing just started growing. And
you mean like it was just going to get a life of its own?
Yeah. It was extraordinary to be a part of that. Sure. And so in some sense, I had my plans, and then I realized my plans are irrelevant because God actually had these other plans, and that my training was being orientated for His purposes.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing of present yourself as a vessel.
Yes.
I was one of those vessels who was saying, no, I'm a vessel for the Lord now, and this vessel's decided that this vessel's going to do this.
Yeah.
Well, you learn as you get older in life, as I've gone, to stop fighting the Lord on those things. Yes.
Are you talking about Romans 12? Present yourself as a living sacrifice?
I had one of those moments, now where you realize, no, you're not in charge, Simon Brace. You need to actually be quiet and try and listen to the Lord.
It's like God said, brace yourself, Simon.
That's right.
Here we go.
and you know what's powerful is God had a couple of people in my life that were real believers, and they would speak truth to me.
Come on.
And not mince their words.
Yeah. Don't we all need that?
Yeah. And I realized, man, I don't like to hear what you're saying, but you're right. And that's the things that I'm so grateful for as well. He had people there who weren't going to be bullied by my, you've read a few philosophy books, Mr. Smarty Pants now. What do you, no, I had those kinds of frank conversations, and I am so grateful for those people in my life, and mentors and disciples and people that would challenge me about commitment and sticking with it and following through on some of these things.
Come on.
And it's through difficult times as well, you know. And so that's really how Rasha Christi was birthed. There were 5 of us, 2 students, Randy Hardman, Brendan Helms. There was a dear friend of mine, Blake Anderson, who was like this administrative genius, because you always need a guy with the gift that nobody wants, was the gift of administration.
Which is actually a spiritual gift according to the Bible.
Yes, it's actually, in some sense, it's like the belt. It holds everything together, you know, because you've got all these gifts that everybody wants, but then those people often can't organize themselves.
Yes.
So the gift of administration is so important to the body of Christ, because often the people are all over the place. And then the guy who was like the mentor of it, a guy by the name of Duke Hale, and then I became the kind of leader of this kind of motley crew kind of thing. And
sorry, why the name Rasha Christi?
Okay, so we thought a lot about names, and we wanted to have some kind of, because we're in the universities, we wanted it to kind of be kind of academic-ish, so we thought, well, maybe a bit of Latin might kind of...
Just throw it in there.
And the people thought, well, what about they won't understand that? And we think, well, that's not necessarily a negative thing, and they would ask, what's it about? And it just means the reason of Christ.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's what it means. And,
beautiful.
Yeah. And so we gave it that name, and kind of it's like our brand thing now, and we are Rasha Christi, and I've got my little Rasha Christi shirt here with my little thing here. So the 2 squares are the faith and reason coming together.
I love it.
That's the 2 overlappings. Faith and reason are not opposed to each other. Faith and reason come together.
That's something that I've realized has become in my own life, but I'm also seeing it more and more. You know, I personally come from a typical religious, cultural Christian background. Then later in life, when I got saved, I was exposed to, you know, the charismatic movement, the extreme charismatic movement, and sort of in between, and you know, there's different flavors.
Yes.
And I definitely, now that I mean I've come to know there's been this word of faith movement in the world that has had a great impact on the charismatic world. And when you look at all these things, one of the things that I picked up was sometimes that Christians in some of these spheres, they're almost afraid to make a reasonable case for Christ, to make a reasonable case for the validity of the Bible, to make a reasonable case, because they either don't know, or they're like, no, man, you must just believe. And when Christians have valid concerns, questions, want to understand, and they are shut down, that actually does more harm than good. So I think it's amazing that there's someone like your organization, or an organization like yours, that can train, help, equip, empower Christians, especially young student Christians, to be able to give an account for the hope that they have in Christ, because the Bible says we need to be able to give an account. Yeah.
So no, look, I also, like yourself, have my history in terms of church. I come from the wild-eyed, charismatic side of the church. I didn't grow up in mainstream churches. Okay. My parents weren't very religious. I mean, they're like a lot of South African parents. They subscribe to a Christian ethic at some level, but they're not really interested, when I was young, in the things of the Lord and going to church and that kind of thing. Of course, I love them deeply. My mom is now, my dad is now, but you know, they're people who've taken a few shots in life. So it's a work in progress.
So they're still alive?
Yes, they are, and I love them both very. My dad's coming to visit me soon, and I'm looking forward to seeing him. I haven't seen him for a while because he's in the UK now.
Oh, wow, okay.
And my books here, my mom, that's how she serves our ministry. She gathers all the books I can't find in South Africa, and she sends them to me, and that's how she helps me out. That's why I've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau here. Thanks, Mom. And Karl Marx. There's Karl Marx down there. We're going to talk about him later.
Yes.
But no, you're right. I also kind of had that background, and I want to give a word of encouragement to my Pentecostal charismatic friends that, my prayer is that somewhere along the line, we can add to your zeal this love of the mind, this cultivation of the Christian mind, because then things are going to get really interesting. When we start to put those two things together, the great commandment, love God with both heart and mind. Because a lot of the churches, we end up with some kind of bifurcation of this issue. We end up with a lot of people who propositionally can say things that are true of Christianity, but they don't seem that enthusiastic about the whole affair. And so you can have some deadness there in some of these mainstream churches. And then you've got these zealots out there who want to conquer the world for Jesus, but they don't have enough truth in them.
Yes.
And we need to be able to contend for the faith. 1 Peter 3:15 talks about that. Colossians 4 talks about our conversations being seasoned with salt so that we might know how to answer everyone.
Yes.
And these were the kinds of verses which captivated me as a young Christian or as a coming back prodigal son. And I knew that
that's beautiful.
I needed to add to my zeal some knowledge and some truth so that I could speak to the Muslims with more confidence and deal with the issue of fear. Paul talks about this at the end of chapter 1 in Philippians, that he talks about coming together in unity, that we would stand, but that we would not be fearful in the presence of our opponents.
Yeah.
And much of the fear that exists within the hearts of Christians today is born out of, I think, to a large extent, is born out of the notion that you don't really understand what those people believe, and so you're not quite sure how to engage them.
Yeah.
And you're worried that this conversation is just going to be a train wreck.
Yeah.
And so then you never have the courage to really tactfully press into those issues. Yeah.
Or on the negative side, you just write them off.
True.
Like they're just barbarians, or they think differently, so what's the use, or there's no way, which is actually in a way fear. Like I don't want to engage. And I know I've had those struggles in myself. Like both of what you've mentioned and what I mentioned now, you either go like, there's no way, or where do I even start? Where do I even begin this conversation? You know, and I think the thing that should be driving real believers is, do you really love the unbeliever?
For sure.
Do you really love them? Do you really have a passion to see them have an encounter with the gospel?
For sure.
Would you agree?
No, I agree with you. And I mean, no place taught me more than that when I was at Speaker's Corner, because we used to deal with some pretty hardcore Muslims. I mean, some of the guys who were there were suicide bombers.
Wow.
So we're talking about some pretty hardcore. Yeah. And when you're in the company of guys like that, you really have to have the Lord go there and give you a heart for loving them, because on the face of it, it's not like they're coming to you with a pleasant conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to have a blunt conversation there with all kinds of colorful language and things hurled at you. And so you've got to realize, look, the Lord died for these people. And we met, and that was where I think the Lord showed me about, he showed me a few things. He pointed out my own ignorance. That was uncomfortable. And then he said to me, my gospel is going to conquer these people.
Wow.
And that's powerful. And I saw, not often at that corner, but man, I saw things happen there where you're speaking in front of huge crowds, and you see in the conversation, you see in somebody, you see the truth penetrate into their soul.
The lights start going on.
And then I saw all kinds of interesting things happen there, and that's stuck with me now.
Yeah.
And so because
I think a lot of us are stuck in this Christian bubble. You know, I mean, you've had the privilege of traveling the world and seeing these things firsthand. But the average Christian in South Africa grow up in a Christian bubble of some kind, either cultural or, you know, just very limited view of Christ, of Christianity, of the world.
For sure.
And we need to be exposed to other things.
For sure.
And this brings me to a question that I've been having for a few minutes now, that since you've been talking, you went to study philosophy, which is, if I understand it correctly, it's to think about how we think. Is that a correct short summary? So
Yes.
so you think about the way that people think. And when we talk about, the field that you're in, what I find fascinating is you purposefully go into spaces like a Muslim crowd or wherever you've been, where there's a clash of thinking, different ways, right?
That's correct.
And when we think of spiritual warfare, that's exactly what it talks about.
For sure.
2 Corinthians 10,
Yes.
Ephesians 6,
Yes.
thoughts, the way you think, strongholds, these things. I mean, is that how have you seen that in practice?
So you're coming now into the area that we need to talk about very seriously as Christians, because Colossians, the book of Colossians talks about philosophy. It says, beware of philosophy. So what a lot of Christians do is they look at that verse and say, okay, if it's philosophical, I got nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, the problem is that not all philosophy is of the same stripe and sort. It says there in Colossians 2:8, it says, beware of philosophy according to human tradition and the principles of this world, and not according to Christ.
Wow.
So there's a philosophy according to Christ then, okay? So what happened to me, and this is it, I had somebody confront me on the issue of abortion. And I was one of those guys who, like some Christians, just think, well, this is a terrible thing, but if anybody should decide, the woman should decide. I was very zealous for the Lord. I was sharing the gospel, but I'd never really been confronted with the ethical questions.
Wow.
I was dealing with things like, I'd never thought about euthanasia or assisted suicide and that kind of thing. I never dealt with the ethical issues. I was a young believer reading John Wesley and just passionate for that kind of thing, and George Whitefield and that. I was discovering that. There's actually a debate between the Arminians and the Calvinists. Like, wow, I didn't even know that.
That is very interesting.
Yeah, so I was a young believer, and then a guy asked me my position, and then he graciously said to me, look, there's a problem with that position, and he gave me an argument. And then he said to me, this is a pragmatic way of viewing these things. And I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know what pragmatism was. And then I realized, man, I really love the Lord, but I've got an idea here that really stinks. This idea about the unborn is wrong. And so
it doesn't line up with Scripture. So where did it come from?
Yeah, and it doesn't even line up. It doesn't even line up with the facts. If life begins at conception and it's human life, then it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. It's human life, and it's worthy of protection.
Amen.
And so I remember realizing, despite the fact that I had a huge love for Jesus, I had some ideas that needed to go.
Yeah.
And that was when I realized, this is this philosophy thing now. I need to discern how, because some of these philosophies are very subtle.
Yeah.
And they can creep in easily,
Would you agree that a philosophy that has become your default way of thinking about a certain thing is what the Bible would refer to as a stronghold? Like you have a stronghold around this matter. It came to you through media or reading something or having a certain group of friends or being exposed to a certain way of thinking for an extended period of time, and now that's ingrained in your thinking. Would you agree that that's what the Bible would call a stronghold, and now it needs to be broken down and redefined?
Yes, I do think that we can make a case that ultimately these battles, which is part of spiritual warfare, is fundamentally a battle for truth. It's a battle of ideas.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally about that.
Okay.
And my quick comment on that would be to point to 3 verses. I'll make 4 that are absolutely foundational to this now. The first is the conversation that Pilate has with Jesus.
Okay.
Because people ask me, I ask them, so what's the main goal of Jesus? And they'll say, he came to save the lost. And everybody's going to go, that's great. And I go to him, absolutely, in some sense, that's not the main goal, okay? Because in his confrontation with Pilate, he says, are you a king? And Jesus says, you have said so. I am a king, and for this purpose I was born. And for this purpose I came into the world to bear witness to the truth. That's his purpose.
Wow.
Your salvation
and
is
then he said, what is truth?
Yes, what is truth? Yeah,
Wow.
So Pilate responds like a postmodern philosopher.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying, no, our salvation is
That's
a part
so
of
good.
that truth. Okay?
That is so good, bro.
And then we
Wow.
think of John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Come on.
If you're John chapter 8. If you are my disciples, you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Because we know
this is good.
If you aren't in truth, you're enslaved to some kind of deception and lies. And then also in that beautiful section in John, he talks about John 16. He talks about the coming of the Holy Spirit, who's called the Spirit of Truth. Yeah. And once these things crystallize for me,
wow,
that then gives you a keel to your Christian walk, then like a keel to a yacht, that despite the waves, and that thing is going to hold that ship, and it's truth.
Yeah.
And that's what we're contending for. We're contending for
all the
truth,
time.
all the time.
So we need to know what the truth is,
True.
which is Jesus. He's also the Word. I mean, these things are, you're triggering so many thoughts now. I love it. It's powerful.
Yes.
Come on.
So these are the things that happened to me, and then I realized, look, I've got to get on board with this. And the thing that philosophy does is it concerns itself with the fundamental assumptions that people have, like assumptions about truth itself.
Yeah.
That's a discussion in a philosophy. What is truth?
Yeah.
The question that Pilate asked you. And of course, it's not a new question.
Yeah.
We've been discussing this. All people have discussed this question in
Yeah.
all civilizations, because nothing's more fundamental than truth.
Because if your truth is something specific, that's where you will live from. That's how you make your
correct.
decisions, how you form family, how you form your community, right?
For sure. And what's particularly important regarding that is we're now living in a time now where the philosophy of our age has done, and there's a spectacular verse in Daniel, the philosophy of our age has thrown truth into the ground.
Yeah.
That's Daniel. It's a hallmark of the Antichrist. Okay.
Wow.
Now that's strong Christian language, but I'm not afraid to use that in conversation with brothers. The hallmark of a philosophy that I would say is a philosophy not according to Jesus is one that rubbishes or trashes truth.
Yeah.
And there's no philosophy that does that better than the philosophy that is gripping, and I'm going to say this with some conviction, our nation now.
Yes.
Not over there, here in our own country, okay? We aren't just having this as some side issue. This philosophy is driving everything in our country. And many people think that somehow our political parties are the folks running the show in South Africa. They are not.
No.
They take their cues from our universities, who have sired, invented, and dreamed up these spectacularly bankrupt philosophies. Those get seeded into the minds of the politicians, who then, in the positions of power, then set about implementing those ideas and culture. The political parties are downstream from our universities. And it's not just true of our nation, it's true of all nations. Okay. If you look at how culture is formed, it's formed through institutions.
Yeah.
And the core institutions that shape society
Educational.
is the academy, are the churches, and then the one which I care the most about is the family.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you can control those institutions, okay, you can control the culture. You can produce the kind of culture you want. And so this is why philosophy becomes so important to Christians in our times, is that if you study this, and I've taken some time to study these things, you can see this clearly.
Yeah.
Now, part of the problem is a lot of what's going on in our culture is so fantastically subversive.
Sure.
And so a lot of people, it doesn't seem so obvious.
Yeah.
But what I typically do in a lot of my work is I take people and I bump you into the furniture you've bumped into that you know that's there.
Yeah.
You just don't know how it came there.
Okay.
How do we end up with a society now where people believe that the man of the year is a woman?
Yeah. I
Okay,
mean, how did that happen? How did we get here?
How did we get here?
Yeah.
This is a good question.
Yeah.
I want to know how we get here. How do we get to a position where we've got an organization which says if you're going to be opposed to racism, you also need to be opposed to the nuclear family?
Yeah.
And when BLM came onto, I was like, what is the relationship between being anti-racist and anti-family? How do those two things fit? I couldn't make any sense of that. And then you start doing your homework philosophically. Now I know why BLM is anti-family now, And this has been the power of understanding the philosophy, because you can exegete yourself till you're blue in the face. But studying the epistles is not going to help you diagnose some of these other philosophical issues. And so you ought to, in your exegesis, take a lesson from Paul here, who in Acts 17 demonstrates to us that he was familiar with the philosophies of his age.
Yeah.
And so too, then, I've tried to do this to encourage people and to equip myself to understand the times we're living in, so that we can equip Christians to stand.
Yeah.
And in my case, to be focused in that at our universities with Ratio Christi, because they are the chief institutions driving things in the culture through the ideas. And so it's very important for us to be amongst the young Christian men and women on campus, and to...
So your positioning there is very strategic.
We understand that culture's downstream from the universities.
Wow.
So whatever you've got going on in the university, in any given nation, that's what you're going to get in the culture.
Yeah.
Make no mistake.
Yeah.
And so, and look, the people who run the universities and people who have these other worldviews that aren't Christian, they know exactly how this works. And they are masters of controlling this scenario now. And it is fantastically subversive.
Sure.
And I just like to pull the mask off of all of that. And that's what I feel that the Lord has called us to do. I think I always felt that the Lord wanted me to come back to Africa. Because, I think we all want to make a difference.
Yeah, sure. Amen.
And then you wonder, what difference can I make?
Yeah.
And then as I walked through the journey, he said to me, this is what you're going to do.
Sure.
You're going to show people what's going on here. You're going to tell people that this thing that to my black Christian brothers, you're being lied to.
Yeah.
This is not decolonization, folks.
No.
This is not transformation.
No.
You've been sold another European philosophy, namely it's Marxism.
There we go.
Marx was a German Jew. All of the scholars that are being appealed to in our universities, they're a pack of German idealists and French existentialists and European feminists.
And I mean, let's get back to the how. How did this happen? Especially if many of the universities that we even have in South Africa were supposedly founded by Christians and missionaries, and over. I remember you speaking about this at our men's conference a couple of years ago. You mentioned how it was a strategic 50-year plan of getting to where we are now. Just maybe explain a little bit about that, so we can get a better picture of why we are here where we are globally, and how was it that it was so fast-tracked during COVID, and all these things that are happening. It seems that there was a strategy behind it all.
Yes, and the answer to that question in some sense is one of history. So what you can do is you can take these contemporary scholars, and I've got a number of them here. So for example, if you take, let's go with, in the area of sexuality, this is the most important text around now. This is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Okay, this is like the Bible to a lot of universities, to our current intellectual elite. And if you read her work, or you, for example, take another famous feminist who's calling for the abolition of family, like Sophie Lewis, the not so subtly titled book, Abolish the Family. Literally, Abolish the Family. And you read their works, you realize that they aren't bringing a new philosophy to the table. Okay. They have built their stuff on the shoulders of others. And you quickly then move from what I would call then is this intellectual elite called the social justice scholars in our universities. Yeah. And you find that their philosophy stands upon the shoulders of a lot of French existentialism and German idealism, in particular, the philosophical framework of Hegel, which is the dialectic. That's why, for example, Shulamith's famous feminist text is called The Dialectic of Sex.
A bit more like this.
There we go. Okay, so these are some of this little pile here. These are like some of the landmark works now. Okay.
That influences young people on university level.
That the faculty, to a large extent, subscribe to at multiple levels. Nothing's more influential in South Africa than this little tome here, which is Pedagogy of the Press. This is the Brazilian Marxist educational theory, and the approach to transformation in our universities is driven by the ideas of this man. And it's nothing less than the Marxification of the South African education system. That is fundamentally what it is then.
So I think we need to take a moment, just briefly. So there might be many people listening that have no idea what you just talked about. So I remember listening to you a few times, and it finally helped me to understand what are the fundamentals of Marxism, so that I can understand the world we live in. I remember when you broke it down, that it's all about that they push down people's throats, that there is the oppressor and there are the oppressed.
For sure.
And if you don't fall, you've either fallen the one or the other, and depending on which one you fall in, that's how you'll be treated. And that has gotten many different varieties of how that's been pushed down. We see it in reverse racism, we see it in BEE, we see it in all these things.
Yes.
So maybe just, if I know it's probably difficult, but for lay people, a quick definition of Marxism. You said elitism, not
intellectual elitism.
Yes, and the French existentialism.
Okay, so it's a question of history in some sense, if you want to understand it, because you're right. You can pick up on a whole bunch of other issues within the conversations now. You can look at this linguistically. You can look at this in the area of critical race theory and legal studies.
Yeah.
You can look at it in post-colonial theory with like Frantz Fanon's work. Okay, and so. You can, but if you want to kind of get down to how did this thing get you, it's a question of history, and you can track the trail ideologically from contemporary scholars, and you just go back and you pick up the line. Now, because I've got a degree in philosophy, that's easier for me to do, and I can pick up on the main epistemological. That's a fancy word that we use in philosophy for how we come to deal with or know knowledge. Okay, yes. And once you see that, then you'll see it traces all the way down to ultimately Karl Marx's works, and he was a young Hegelian. Okay, so all of this stuff is born out of German idealist philosophy following a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant. Okay, historically.
Okay.
And it's profoundly also influenced by the French Revolution. Okay, we don't understand the significance of that event for people globally. Okay, and particularly the work of people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau here. Okay. And these secular developments and this secular revolution kind of sets up the scene for Karl Marx to come along, who's a radical within Europe, and he comes up with a philosophy in which he thinks he's diagnosed the problems of the world.
Yes.
Okay, and his view is that there is disparity or inequality within society, and he thinks he's diagnosed the problem, and he thinks he's got the solution and the way out of this. Okay, and so he obviously is living in the middle of the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. He says sees a lot of exploitation, and we must respect the impulse of many Marxists that. We see that true here in South Africa. It's not that we are ignorant of poverty and suffering and toil and struggle. And
so it's a fact. It's the thing of there are facts, and when we look at the facts, we see the same thing, but people jump to different conclusions.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so then what he comes in, he comes in with his philosophy, and he thinks he owns this issue. He's diagnosed it, and he has a way out of it.
Yeah.
And so he brings in his philosophy. He thinks that the problem is in a very simplistically that we've got to divide people up into two classes. This is a fancy French word, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the oppressors and the oppressed.
Yeah.
Okay. And so he stratifies society along those lines. He's got some concepts of labor theory and doctrine of alienation and that stuff, which is important to what he's saying. But for our purposes this morning, basically, he sees that society is stuck in this scenario, and we need to have a rupturing. And for him, he was using the Hegelian dialectic that somehow society is moving through this historical period. It's called historical dialectical materialism. Marx is an atheist. Materialism, all is matter. And as we move down the course of history, so we move from one state of affairs to the next because of the tensions that exist between things. So think about feudalism in Europe. We went from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. And they put just about everything now on this framework of thinking. And in Marx's case, it was fundamentally about class and economics. There are people who have property and title, they control the means of production, and then all the workers are basically enslaved to them, and they never see the fruits of their labor. This is his labor theory. And they're alienated from their work, and this leaves people being treated in an inhumane way. If you read Paulo Freire's work, that's what they talk about. The rehumanization of people. It's a terminology that you find amongst all these Marxists using. They think they're bringing humanity back to people. But that's powerful. If that's what you think your project is, that's a powerful thing to think that you're doing. And so he's infatuated with this idea, and he thinks it's a scientific explanation. But unfortunately, Marx never gets to see his philosophy implemented. Okay? It doesn't really materialize until 1917, when the Russians, who in the middle of the First World War, decide, no, some of the Russians, the Bolsheviks under Lenin's authority, there's a revolution. I mean, Europe's in the middle of this fantastically nihilistic, meaningless war. 19 million people dead. It's terrible. And he starts a revolution in Russia. And a lot of people are excited about this event and this development, thinking that this is a new society potentially. We're going to emerge out of these previous things. And a lot of your young Marxists in Europe are intoxicated with this development. Well, if you actually study the history of that, it doesn't end well for the Russians within a few years. Within a few years, they've got mass starvation. And ironically, it's the Americans that have to bail them out, the capitalists. Anyway,
that is irony.
You can study that then, and then we know the rest of the story, because then it just goes from bad to worse, because then Stalin comes in. And if ever there was a guy who was a leader you didn't want, it was Stalin. I mean, what he did to the Russian people is just unbelievable. And Solzhenitsyn's famous for his work where he exposed a lot of this. But a lot of the people elsewhere were still intoxicated with this idea. And then they began to ask, well, why isn't the revolution happening here? We want the revolution here. And then they said, well, maybe Marx's analysis was okay, but it wasn't deep enough. And along comes a new generation. This is 1920s now. We're doing a little historical tour now. People like Gramsci come in, and they say Marx was correct for the most part, but he didn't go deep enough. And so we not only do we need to critique people on the basis of their class and their economic standing, we also need to critique them at a level of culture. Okay, because all the institutions in society control the society through the values, and he had this concept of hegemony. And this, if you've got values that are in that society, it kind of calcifies it. And then
just explain hegemony.
So this is the concept that you have an overarching system of values or ideas within these institutions that prevent it from being moved because they anchor it in some sense. And so what you got to try and do is you got to break that value system within all of the institutions. And so Gramsci is a very famous individual, and he's followed by what is called the Frankfurt School, which would be people like Adorno, Horkheimer, and people like George Lukács, part of the Frankfurt School, and they buy into Gramsci's idea. And so in some sense, Antonio Gramsci is really the father of the cultural battle that we are in now, even here in South Africa. He's the one who says, is it a cultural Marxism? Because if you want a revolutionary outcome, you've got to first capture the culture, and you do that by capturing the universities, the churches, and you transform it. You move it from its state of false consciousness, which is where people are kind of duped by the existing worldviews and values. In his case, it would have been the Christian worldview. And you displace that with a Marxist way of seeing things. And that's the shift. What a lot of time Marxists will talk about, a shift from false consciousness to critical consciousness.
Do you think, there's so much happening and going through my mind, but the end game of the, let's call it the Marxist revolution, would the end game be for them to really implement what they believe will make a better world? Or do you think behind the utopia that they are after, there's actually just a power grab going on? Or do you think there's some legitimate feeling of this will be a better world? Or is it more like, well, when we have it, we can control everything?
Well, I think you have two kinds of people. You have those who actually, I think, really believe it. I think what's terrifying to read is I think Joseph Stalin really believed this.
Okay.
Because if you look at some of his statements about him understanding Marxism, he's not a fool.
All right.
He writes very, very clearly and succinctly on these ideas. He understood this from a philosophical point of view, and I think
he was probably just a psychopath, but the way he understood
he just had immense power and authority to do what he wanted.
Wow.
And they're not fearful because it's an atheistic worldview. So there's no fear of God in their minds
or value for life. I'm guessing.
No, and of course,
even though they say they value the life of the oppressed, in the implementation of the idea, you don't actually see that happening, right?
Yeah, well,
it's ironic, isn't it, in a way?
You value the life of the oppressed, and the oppressed turn out to be those with whom you agree.
Okay.
Because anybody who doesn't agree with you is a problem and needs to be eliminated, even if those people themselves are poor. And we saw this in Russia.
And that's exactly what we're seeing now.
So this kind of thinking is a collectivist, ideological kind of thinking. It demands conformity of thought.
And if you don't agree with me, you hate me.
Yeah, that's basically it. And so this is why we're now living in the world where we're fighting over things like freedom of speech. Because this philosophy cannot tolerate dissension.
Yeah.
It hates, and now we're having laws being passed in South Africa because it's the freedom of speech. What do you mean by that? Things that do disagree with a progressive ethic. That's basically what they mean by that.
Or if you say anything that hurt my feelings.
Yeah, that's right.
That shouldn't be allowed.
And
but it's a broad definition.
Yes. So of course we've got all these judiciary people thinking that we're doing something wonderful for the transformation and restorative justice and all this. It's nothing short of the Marxification of South African culture, and it's been driven by our universities in the departments where they're now teaching this philosophy in critical theory, or in education where they're teaching critical pedagogy, or in linguistics where they're teaching critical discourse analysis, or if you're in the corporate world and you're diving into diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is the same thing.
Yeah.
And so all these new gender theory, it's all just it's an application of the philosophy of this historic philosophy, critical theory, to that respective discipline, to entrench this and displace the existing value system, Now, this is a clear mandate. We find that call for the trans value of getting rid of the existing value systems earlier in the work of Nietzsche in his not so subtly titled book called The Antichrist, All right. If you want to understand how did the Europeans invent a self-loathing philosophy, just read this little book here. I mean, this is a tome here. And look, you think that people have been vitriolic or hateful of Christianity, but nobody said it as, just here we go. Just listen to this now. Christianity remains to this day the greatest misfortune of humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you think that your contemporary atheists are hostile, long before they got angry about Christianity, this guy had nothing but contempt for the Christian faith.
Wow.
He actually even extols Buddhism over Christianity. Well, we're experiencing that now in our culture. You can say what you want about Christianity, but you dare not critique the other religions.
Yeah, because they are the oppressed, right?
Yeah, they're the oppressed.
And the Christians are the oppressors historically.
That's right.
So for me, that was a huge light bulb that went on, because the moment I learned from you, it's the oppressors and the oppressed, and they pull up tables on paper and go, okay, so if you are in this category, no matter what, we will protect you. You cannot be, so for example, if a Muslim were to say something hateful to a Christian, that's okay.
Yes.
Because they were oppressed.
They were oppressed.
But if a Christian says something hateful towards a Muslim, that's have to be persecuted.
That's probably
it's hate speech. You're straight to jail.
Yes.
So there's this uneven justice anything in the line of
this asymmetrical kind of behavior on the part of the universities.
Yes, the rules apply to you, but not to me, because
so that's why diversity and inclusion projects are just a complete and utter farce, because it presupposes this very way of diagnosing society. Because from Marx's time, it was a much more basic analysis along the lines of class and economics. They've diversified this now, and where we are today in the modern way of understanding it is we're at what is called the matrix of oppression tables. Now you can go online and look for the stuff. If you want to find good examples, go and look at Patricia Hill Collins' work. I don't have a book here with it now. These are texts now which are foundational to our educational system, and on those tables you'll see they have got columns. Now, according to them, this is the way to bring about restorative justice to our communities, is to teach all young people and our judiciary and everybody else and the intelligentsia that when we are engaging with people in our social relations in society, that we should get rid of the idea of assessing people based upon their character. That actually we should judge people by their race.
Yes.
It's kind of weird. We're going back to the apartheid protocol,
which is so nuts, and that's what we see.
Judge them by their language group, and judge them by their race, and judge them by their religion, and judge them by what they have or what they don't have. Whether they're actually, if you're able-bodied, because if you're an able-bodied, you're probably in the oppressor class. It even has to do. We've now got disciplines of fat studies or obesity studies. Okay, we have all of these categories which are the what they call the intersectional way of viewing people, and they think that the right way to approach people now is to judge them based upon all those categories, and then you find out whether they are in the oppressed or the unoppressed class. And don't worry, they've got the scholars to help you do this with a nice table.
And basically, if you are white, if you have the language of the oppressor, Afrikaans, if you're male, if you are Christian,
if you're heterosexual, if you're married,
heterosexual, you are the main oppressor, right?
In fact, we should be running from ourselves, Heinz. You and I should be running from ourselves, because we are the worst kinds of people. We are inherently the people that need to be. We should not be. Our voices should not be heard, because we are basically the paragons of all that is wrong with the world. And the crazy thing about this is all of the stuff in particularly the social sciences, they put everything on this overtly simplistic philosophical framework. It's the dialectic now. Everything goes into the dialectic. If it's not male versus female, if it's not fat versus thin, if it's money versus not, if it's white versus black, and they just dump everything onto this framework and think they've got such a powerful insight into diagnosing the culture and seeing where all of the systems of oppression are of. But this entire project boils down to one thing. It is the displacing of the existing value system within any given nation, and in our country, South Africa, and putting in this philosophy, okay? And this is why, and I mentioned to you, if I was to title our talk today, I would title it along the lines of exposing the greatest lie in South Africa today.
Wow.
That the whole decolonization movement and transformation mumbo jumbo that you hear coming out of the mouths of our politicians, and certainly from our universities, has nothing with doing with returning people to their African cultural roots. Okay, if you to read, for example, the works of John Mbiti, who's a fairly renowned scholar on African culture, okay, you will find out now that there's much about, and I don't presume to be an expert on African culture, but I can learn from scholars like him. And I've got friends of mine who are authorities on African culture. African Klope is somebody whom I think you should interview, because he can speak to this, and there's many others as well. But there's much about African culture which is completely incommensurate or incompatible with all of this philosophy. It is fundamentally secular. It doesn't acknowledge God. all African belief systems, the vast majority of them acknowledge the existence of God.
Yeah.
They believe in the traditional view of family, the binary.
Yeah.
Okay. They have a regard for respect for elders.
Yeah.
Marxism has nothing but contempt for any kind of hierarchy, including respect within your family. That's why Marx calls ultimately the call for the abolition of family precedes Marx in some sense, but he lays it out very carefully here in the Communist Manifesto. Let me read this statement to you. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry. All the family ties among the proletariats are torn asunder, and the children transformed into simple articles of commerce and the instruments of labor. He calls explicitly here for the abolition of family.
Wow.
Okay, so when you begin to put this together, you realize why an organization like BLM is calling for anti-racism, but the abolition of the family. It's because they're Marxists. And
it's the same mindset.
This is what the feminists are doing.
Yeah.
And this is what our universities are doing.
Yeah.
They're calling down with the binary, whether it's UCT or it's Stellenbosch, or God forbid that conservative school up in Potchefstroom, Northwest University, which I just want to break the news to everybody in South Africa. Northwest University is not a conservative school.
Not anymore.
That is another lie in South Africa, okay? If you look at its policy documents and if you look at its curriculum, it is fundamentally committed to the same project.
Wow.
What is the project again? It is the establishment of this cultural Marxist philosophy within our academic institutions, then bleeds into everything else in politics and culture. And the worst thing about it is it is so subversive because they will then take this philosophy, this Hegelian German idealistic dialectic with a dose of Karl Marx, a lot of Nietzsche thrown in there, a bit of Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and that. You will have Frantz Fanon in there. He will feature at some extent. But for the most part, this is a European philosophy that hated Europe, okay?
Yeah.
And so what they do...
Written by white men mostly.
Exactly, fundamentally by white men.
Yeah.
And then what they try to do then is they try to convince all of our black brothers and sisters that this is returning you to your African
It's going to work for you as well.
Yes,
you know?
yeah. So it's out with colonialism and in with just another European philosophy. So you're just being colonized version 2.0.
It's a colonization of the mind rather than a physical one.
Yeah. So, but as long as you just throw Ubuntu on the end of the sentence, so our black brother, and this is what they do. They've imperialized over this issue now.
Sure.
And I was speaking to some students of ours at UKZN, and they were law students. And in one of the classes, one of these beautiful students had the courage to say to the professor, hang on a sec, you said you're returning us here to African philosophy, but in all the classes we've had so far, I haven't heard a single African philosophy.
Wow.
I mean, I know that Jean-Paul Sartre was definitely not Khoisan. Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida definitely not Xhosa or Zulu.
Yeah.
Karl Marx definitely not of the Bantu Nguni tribe.
Yeah.
And even if you say, well, what about Frantz Fanon? Well, I encourage everybody, go and read his work. Wretched of the Earth is probably the most famous one of his works, okay? There's no book that has had more animated a lot of black political leaders who of a revolutionary spirit than this text, okay?
Wow.
Because it's explicit. He calls explicitly for a socialist revolution on the continent of Africa. Okay,
what would that look like even?
Well, what it would look like, and he doesn't say it yet, it definitely would include purging the continent of Christianity. Okay, all right, he doesn't mind that. But notice this, and he doesn't have the courage to say it, I think, as I read this text, is it also means the smashing of traditional African culture.
Yeah.
Because it requires the smashing of the family. It requires the tearing down of any hierarchical structures, which in African culture is an important thing to them.
Wouldn't it actually imply the smashing of Ubuntu in a way?
But this is what's difficult.
But they're using it.
Yeah, so they capture the Ubuntu thing and they say, well, we're communism and you've got a communal culture. It's the same thing.
Oh, it's
not the same thing.
That's a lie.
And so what we've got to do now is challenge our Christian, black Christian brothers and sisters, and I would challenge any African people out there, said, look, if we're to talk about the future of this nation and come up with a philosophy by which to govern ourselves, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that this stuff here is African. It is not. It is born out of German idealism. It is fundamentally undergirded by the Hegelian dialectic, and it is fueled by the ideas of Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, Derrida, Foucault, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and you can bring that all the way. And even if you pick the feminist line of it and you go through the works of whether it's, you begin with the Russian feminists, Kollontai, which is where I think we ought to start with the feminists and not Simone de Beauvoir, who was Jean-Paul Sartre's girlfriend. You can follow that all the way through to Shulamith Firestone, and even down to today, where Sophie Lewis, a contemporary feminist scholar, is simply saying what Shulamith Firestone said in the 1970s, but not as articulately. I mean, I've always wondered how I can understand why the feminists are so angry. No work has helped me more to understand the movement than this work. I disagree with just about every page she wrote, but she writes well. I can actually follow her. And trying to get through gender trouble here is no easy thing. Okay. Judith Butler does not write particularly clearly. Okay, but make no mistake, she is standing upon the shoulders of this tradition now. Okay, and this is, like I said to you, in some sense, what I have on the table here are pretty much most of the foundational texts to what's going on in our universities today, and we need to, as South African citizens, we need to unmask this, you know, and these universities, institutions belong to the South African people, and many of the South African people are Christians.
They don't believe this stuff.
And we don't believe this stuff. I'm thinking, for example, large African-initiated churches, like the ZCC movement or the Amazayoni. These are massive. I mean, they dwarf in terms of size and scale. The ZCC movement has a Christian heritage that comes from evangelical, Bible-believing Christians who preach the gospel to some Zulus in Wakkerstroom in northern Natal.
Wow.
And that's where the church began. They get their word Zion Christian Church, not from Jerusalem, but from Zion City, Illinois in the USA. Okay. That's where, because of missionaries that came from there. And you've got a mass of people now, the ZCC, and I've met many of them, who believe in God. They believe in the scriptures. I'm not saying there aren't issues here. There are issues with syncretism that we need to address within, not just in African churches. Let's face it, white churches as well. Because if you say to people, well, you've got syncretism problems there, I'd say white people have got syncretism. You're a materialist. You're bringing your own idols into this thing now as well.
Does this help me understand syncretism? I don't know that term.
When a lot of Christians sometimes struggle with keeping orthodoxy clear because we end up pulling in things into the faith that ought not be there.
All right.
Okay.
So, for example, with the Zionists, would it be that they still speak to the ancestors,
and that's because
still brought in there,
and that's because. And John Mbiti talks powerfully about this, the difficulty for African people, because of how important that the person is in their rites of passage and the respect.
It's ingrained.
The respect for them. When they see the Christianity, they sometimes struggle to distinguish that which is good from that which needs to be moved out. Okay.
So your point is that's for them. It's kind of obvious as a Western person looking at that, but we should also look at ourselves. What are the things that we are including in our faith that shouldn't be there? Do I understand you correctly?
Like this mad consumerist culture where people just got hoarding stuff.
Yeah. And I think that the biggest god of our Western time is convenience and comfort.
That's right. Or you think your identity is in the thing that you do.
Yeah, your job.
Your job. You know, I'm a this, and you're not any of those things. That's just what you do.
Yeah. That's
not who you are. So we often look down our nose at these things in a kind of arrogant kind of way, and that needs to stop. Okay, so
let's look at ourselves and think through a proper biblical lens of what's really important.
And so we've got a lot of work to do. But coming back to the point now, if I had an audience with the ZCC leadership, if the Lord ever privileged me with that, I would appeal to them. I said to them, Zion Christian Church, that Christian, let's talk about.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? You've got the Bible. It's an authority at some level. You believe in traditional concepts of the family. Okay, so do I. You don't think that homosexuality is normative. Okay, you believe in some kind of hierarchy and respect here.
Yeah.
I said the political parties that want you to support them have contempt for that.
Yeah.
And they come to you here at the beginning of elections, and they want you and your constituents to all vote for them.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they are also the ones implementing educational policies, often supported by people from the outside, that teach principles and values completely incompatible with your own value system.
You will send your child to school, and they will learn something completely contrary to what you believe.
So what you're teaching your parents of your kids, which is important. Parents are the most important people in the lives of young children. That's a God arrangement, by the way.
Yes.
And here we've got a philosophy which wants to do violence to the sacred structure of the family.
Yeah.
And let's face it, I mean, we know this. I think we might statistically, we're the most fatherless nation statistically on the face of the planet.
2/3 of children don't have fathers physically in the home in our nation.
Yes, okay. And so now we've got this catastrophe, which is behind, I would argue, the vast majority of all of our social problems.
Yeah.
Okay. And now we've got our universities, okay, calling for more of the abolition of family.
Yeah, let's make sure no one has a father. Let's make sure no one has a stable home to live in.
Yes, let's go and abolish the family. These are the texts to which our faculties in our humanities, they appeal to these people.
Yeah.
And so we see this coming out of universities like UCT, where they're calling for, the one statement from them was down with the binary.
Yeah.
You know, heterosexuality is a structure of power, and it's in that intersectional category that the rest of us who aren't heterosexuals are oppressed, and so down with the binary.
So it's again the oppressed and the oppressor.
Yes, it's exactly the same thing.
Bringing it in there. Yeah.
And so, I mean, a couple of years ago, Stellenbosch published a work called Disrupting Cis-Heteronormativity in South African Schools. That's right. Thank you, Stellenbosch University.
Wow.
We want to get into the schools and do violence to the ideas that moms and dads have taught their kids about mom and dad is a good thing. We're not the enemies. We're not your oppressors. Yeah. But this is what Marxists have been doing from the beginning. I mean, you can study this historically. Mao Zedong was the master of turning the children against their parents.
They became informants of their own parents.
Yeah, so you snitch on your parents now. And we've got this culture going on in other places. We see this have happened in Canada of late now with the snitching culture, people snitching.
Well, we had it in COVID. It was encouraged in COVID. If your neighbors, if your family is breaking the rules, report them.
Yeah.
That's hectic.
Yeah, and that's part and parcel of this, because it demands collectivism. So in your old school Marxist nations, you had the Gestapo, you had the secret police, you got everybody, and
the
now
thought police.
Yeah, and so in the Western culture, we began our conversation this morning. How do you do that? Well, what happened is the media eventually became captured by just about all the media. Was captured.
But again, like you said, I mean, this is the powerful thing about not your theory, but you've noticed is that, who came from universities? People in every sphere of life. They were trained in a university space or a college, and then they go into the workforce. And many of them are, you've used the word activists. They are trained to be activists wherever they go. So listen, I'm going to teach you to write a script. I'm going to teach you to make films. I'm going to teach you to make TV. But when you get there, make sure that these values are brought into the shows and the stuff that you do. And we will make sure that you get those positions. They wangle, and you see this.
And it was a process. It begins, we can track this. It begins in the 1960s with the 60s sexual revolution.
Yeah.
which fundamentally wasn't a sexual revolution. It was basically a cultural Marxist revolution, where by this stage sex had been centered as part of the narrative, the capture of the narrative in society. They talk a lot about, they don't believe in truth. They talk about power. And Foucault wrote about buyer power and all these concepts. And so in order to control society, we've got to control the discourse, because we've got to get rid of the grand narratives, and we need to have our narrative as the main thing. And so they knew it was going to take time. Marcuse writes a very famous paper called Repressive Tolerance, in which he laments the fact that the liberals then and these folks didn't have access to mass media. Well, it took 50 years, and within 50 years, all of the major media outlets, CNN, Sky News, MSNBC in the US, and even here in South Africa, all of our media outlets,
the main ones,
were leftist and socialist in their thinking. And so they didn't need a Gestapo, because now you had social media. Now you could police the conversation and
feed the conversation.
And when I would get up there and say something, then I would get my wrist slapped and said to them, we're going to cancel you. I mean, I remember posting stuff on Facebook, images about the reality of abortion. I was warned. Wow. You continue with this, we're going to get you off of there.
Wow, you're breaking the community guidelines. You're breaking
the guidelines now. And then along came Elon Musk, and he kind of ruined the party because he bought Twitter.
Yeah.
Okay? But
which was being controlled.
These Western Marxists, of whom the father to a large extent is George Lucas, he's considered the father of Western Marxism, okay? They had these institutions, and that's why this thing suddenly, it kind of reached a threshold, and then suddenly this thing just reared its head out of the ocean.
Yeah, it seemed like it came out of nowhere.
It seemed like it, but it hadn't. It had been germinating and growing, and eventually this thing a couple of years ago was birthed. I remember we were doing a lot of work in churches, and we would be doing a lot of apologetic stuff, and we would be dealing with a lot of, your old school, I call it old school apologetics, reliability of the Bible, archaeology in the Bible, the garden science debate. We had John Lennox, and then we were doing all the contemporary atheists and that. And then all of a sudden, this new thing came out of the ocean, and we were all going, what on earth is this thing?
Yeah.
And so I had to go back now and do some homework now and find out, how do we end up in a world in which it's actually, gender is fluid, where young kids know what they are sexually from a very young age, and if they behave in a certain way, then you groom them.
Yeah.
And if they're uncomfortable with their puberty, why, then you can start giving them puberty blockers and maybe start plowing their bodies with cross-sex hormones, and who knows?
And we call it healthcare.
And we call it healthcare
now. Give it words. Changing words. That's a big thing. If linguistic hijacking is something you taught me.
Yes. There has been a massive shift. And you could just study this along that line in terms of the linguistic aspect of this. It's the capturing of the language, because if you can capture the language, then you can control the grand narrative.
Yeah, okay. Family doesn't mean family.
You redefine that, John.
Yeah,
you
man means something else. Woman means something else.
Yeah, we can't define. And I mean that we have Judith Butler to thank for that nonsense. I mean, page 1 of this text, she even says there is no stable and abiding criteria upon which we can define what a woman is, and so then we can't define what a woman is. And then if you can't define what a woman is, then perhaps our ideas about sex were mistaken. And so that's where we've moved from gender being a social construct to sex being a social construct. And this is the main text.
My goodness.
And so these are the texts that are being used at our universities. This is what, if you have a student in the humanities department, they will be fed this stuff in and around the curriculum. Make no mistake about it. And if they are in the hard sciences, they won't get it as full bore. They will typically get it in their ethics classes. Okay, but even engineers who kind of dealing with steel and concrete or electricity or whatever, and we need those guys to fix stuff for us in our broken country.
Yeah.
But they think they're off the hook. No, you're not. You will get this in your diversity, equity, and inclusion things, and all your policies for your big companies and everything will be made to comply. You will toe the line.
And everything is thrown under this umbrella of social justice, right?
That's right. And
even the words sound so good. It's like, it's social, and there's justice. And I mean, what is actually happening under the umbrella of social justice in our nation?
Yeah, so this is the thing. This is the linguistic witchcraft going on. Is they've captured the language, they've invented a whole bunch of new terminology, medico-juridical tyranny, cis-heteronormativity, allyship, and I've had to learn some of this vocabulary that they employ, and they've got all kinds of things. And then
they're just making up terms, and now everyone has to catch up with them.
Yeah, and so and this is what's powerful. This needs to be explained. And then they take some terms with we're all familiar, and then they imperialize over that term, and they give it a new definition. And when you object, you're the problem.
Yeah, they hollow out the original meaning, and they give it a new meaning, they tell you what the new meaning is.
That's correct.
And if you don't agree, then
you're
there's
the problem.
Something wrong with you. Yeah.
So some words have remained the same, like social justice, and then they've got things like family. They just remake it and redefine it.
Yeah.
Now, on that issue, like, for example, our Constitution talks quite explicitly about social justice, but nowhere in the documentation does it delineate what it means by that.
Define it clearly.
So thankfully, our universities have helped us, and they're going to define it. And you know what it's about?
Thankfully.
It's about returning us all to some kind of socialist utopia.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go into the policy documents of, for example, Northwest University, the new transformation document, which drives that whole institution, all three campuses, or even Stellenbosch University. And I'm pretty sure all these other universities have these same documents. It's all about implementing social justice.
Yeah.
But when you ask them, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
They'll waffle on and they won't be clear. But if you study this stuff, you know that this is what the project is.
It's all about saying, okay, you're oppressors and these are oppressed, so we're going to fix it. We're going to make the oppressors get less and we're going to work against them, and we're going to work for the oppressed, right?
That's right.
That's how the Marxism comes through. It's the bourgeoisie and the...
It's the same categories. They might use different terminologies. It's often across the lines of intersectionality. But they've just expanded that us versus them scenario.
Yeah.
But the real powerful part is when the new words. Now, because think about this. You're a mom and a dad now, and your son or daughter heads off to university now, and they're sitting at the feet of these people, and they get taught a whole bunch of new vocabulary.
Yeah. And they think it's part of their education.
Yeah. And this is the cultic aspect of this. This is what cults do. Cults do this. They invent new terminology, and there's a powerful psychological and social thing that happens with that. Because now you're in a crowd now where we can talk to each other, and they don't really understand us.
And it's this idea of it's new, so it's exciting.
It's exciting.
And my parents never told me this.
Yeah, and then you come back home and your mom and dad seem like they're a bunch of morons
they seem
stuck
stupid.
in the Middle Ages because you've got all this new terminology and your friends and yourself are flying it around on social media and you understand transgender, cis heteronormativity and all these fancy new words that they've invented, and your parents are kind of a bit dumb over there in the bush, you know. And
because
you're
they believe in the Bible.
Okay, mom and dad, but you know, we really are the intellectual. And this is the cultic aspect to this. Is the fabrication and the invention of all this new terminology.
Yeah.
Okay. So one classic example is if you look at in the universities, one of the main words flying around now is called lived experience.
Okay.
Okay. So what has become like the sacred cow now at university is to affirm somebody's lived experience. Okay?
Is that a different way of saying live your own truth?
That's basically saying, in some sense, that the person's life and everything that they've gone through is fundamentally the most important thing about them, and on both in terms of their internal psychology. And the last thing you ought to do is to disrupt that.
Wow.
Because that's an oppressive act now.
Yeah.
So if I defy somebody by saying, look, you've got an idea here, but I think that's false.
Yeah.
I'm guilty of some kind of act of violence against you.
Because you're going against that person's lived experience.
And so if that person's lived experience is that they've gone through this particular sexual lifestyle, who am I to challenge them? Okay.
Yeah.
So this has become lived experience. They'll also use the word standpoint epistemology. okay, which is another fancy word that they use. But basically, this entire way of centering the individual and their own truth, it's moral relativism with just more fancy words, or epistemological relativism to begin with, which then ends up into moral relativism. What's true for me is true for me, and what's true for you is true for you. It's nonsense.
Isn't it back to, the whole thing of, is there even an objective reality? Because that's what we've been finding with this whole move of the ideological things that are being shoved down people's throats is, no, but that's not facts and that's not real. And this is the same thing. My lived experience, my truth is my reality, and you have to accept my reality. If I say, I might be a biological man, but I am a woman, you have to accept that, because that is my lived experience. Is that what we're talking about?
That's what you've got going on. So the modern South, and this begins to a large extent with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, okay, who basically abandoned his kids to the state, all right, and said that in order for somebody to be authentic, he needed to be true to themselves and kind of live according to my desires, and any kind of construct which prevents me from living in accordance with those, that's actually not just in opposition to me, so I need to negate it or critique it, critical theory. It needs to go. And then along come the Marxists, they build up on this. Freud brings the sexual dimension into this, and so now that when somebody's got certain sexual desires, when we as Christians challenge that, we're not only are arrogant, we're actually guilty of some act of violence. And this is why at the
they call us terrorist attack.
Yeah,
almost.
So we're guilty of conversion therapy in the eyes of these people. And this philosophy is tied into the ultimately it's the framework of Kant's distinction when he came along, this giant of a German thinker in his major work, The Critique of Pure Reason. He makes a distinction between the world out there, which is called the noumenal realm, and then the phenomenal world, which is the world of the phenomena. That's your what's in your mind. And this has a long historical, complicated conversation going back to Descartes and all of the rest of it. But for the most part, Kant's philosophy drew a line between the subject and the object, and he ended up making philosophy, whether he intended to or not. Nevertheless, Hegel helped drive this thing along, and then by the time people like Nietzsche and them got hold of it and down that road, we ended up in a subjectivistic kind of culture where the person's subjective experience is primary and fundamental. Yeah. And you need to affirm that.
Yeah. So objective reality out the door, subjective experience is what it's all about.
Yes. But there's a caveat here. Okay, everybody's subjective experience is legitimate and it needs to be affirmed so long as it's not with Jesus Christ. Okay, so this is the self-defeating, self-stultifying nonsense that has pervaded our culture. They don't even hold to their own philosophy consistently.
Sorry, just to understand you correctly, if I say my lived experience and my truth is Jesus Christ, that's not accepted.
No, unfortunately not. You're an oppressor.
That's the irony.
Yes.
Oh, you just broke it open. That's powerful.
So everybody has their own subjective experience, and because there is no truth out there. I mean, what did Nietzsche say? He said truth is a mobile army of metaphors and anthropomorphisms that have lost their sense of vigor. They long since threw truth into the ground.
Did these guys all get high together and then wrote these books?
No, it's an interesting thing to study the history of ideas.
No, I'm just being facetious, but I mean, some of these stuff sounds so crazy and out there.
It does. It is crazy. It is crazy. And I mean, even I do some lectures on this. Even in for example, Northwest University, a fairly recent curriculum. I think it's still in there. Here's the journey of an average high school student. Most of our kids who go through South African high school don't get any training in philosophy. And I think even in the Cambridge, those who do Cambridge, they don't give you some vigorous philosophy there. When you show up at a modern day South African university, okay, you have your hands ideologically tied behind your back.
Because you don't know how to take new thoughts and process.
You don't know the difference between metaphysics and epistemology. Yeah. And what the first project of a modern day South African university is to disabuse you of your common sense and reason, and to show you that the enlightened way is to think like them through this idealistic philosophical, skeptical way of seeing things. That's the intellectual high ground. And once you can convince them that it's arrogant to think that you know truth, that basically truth is really just subjective and lived experience kind of stuff, okay, then you've got them. And this is just the modus operandi. Now, I want to say this with as much force as possible, not just here in South Africa, in all of Western civilization. Okay, the reason why we are in the mess we are in today in Western civilization is not because of Donald Trump or any one of these political leaders or any of the European politicians. It's not them. They all went to university and got these rotten ideas from there. Then they get into positions of power. Then they implement the ideas. That's it. Our universities, again, Gramsci, as much as I disagreed with him, was correct. Once you control the institutions, you control the culture.
Yeah.
So you have to get into the institutions, displace the existing people there with a whole bunch of new people. This is the hegemony battle. And that philosophy, for the most part, is the stuff which we're discussing here. All of the stuff here, all of these texts on my table here, it's the same game that's been played in Europe for recent decades. I mean, let's face it. If Nietzsche, in some sense, is responsible for inventing a self-loathing philosophy, okay? And we've seen how that's I remember being in Britain when, for example, British Airways was embarrassed to have the Union Jack painted on the tail on the tail wing, and so Richard Branson said, "Well, if you're going to be embarrassed, I'll fly the Union Jack." And so I remember that, but now it makes a lot more sense now
where it comes from,
because the self-loathing philosophy was invented, ironically, by a bunch of European men, okay?
Where would the self-loathing thing comes from? Because recently we've seen it in America where the young people go like, down with America, we hate America. And they would be pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, and against America, burning American flags. And that actually caused a groundswell in the opposite direction of a bunch of young conservative men who are like, no, I love my country and I think this is amazing, which is interesting. But the pendulum swung to such a hectic extreme that it seems to be swinging back now. But there's a lot of resistance as well.
Yeah, I know people say that though, but I'm far. I'll be frank with you.
Okay.
I think that they're naive to think that somehow because we've got somebody like Donald Trump, or even within Europe, like you might have conservative political leaders there, like in Italy or some of the other nations, that somehow, this is going to swing. It's not going to swing.
No, but let's just stop at the self-loathing thing for a moment.
Okay.
Maybe I'm wrong about what's happening.
No,
but
we see a pushback against this because fundamentally this philosophy is at war with reality.
Yes.
When the man of the year is a bloke, then it seems like
something's wrong.
Something's wrong.
Yeah, okay. We need help.
Okay. Now, how do we get there? We got there again because the universities drove us there, and there's the book that got us there. There it is there.
Yeah.
That's how we got there.
Sure.
Okay. So the fundamental battle now
is a thought battle.
Is a thought battle, and it's in our universities.
Wow.
This is where the battle begins. It is fundamentally. So until these Americans start to attend to the challenge of their academic institutions, and it's the same for Europe and any other place for that matter, and that this philosophy is challenged and held accountable, okay, they remain in the position of power. Because election cycles will go on election cycles.
Yeah, 4 years from now,
Trump is out and who knows in. But the universities will remain there. Those faculties remain there. They are the ones actually controlling this now, not the political leaders. And this is true of South Africa.
Sure. If we do the test of follow the money behind the universities pushing these things, do you think we'll come to the real source of where it's all coming from?
Well, I think at some level you might argue that. But remember, if it has to do with finances, okay, anybody who's got significant resources has a financial theory of money.
Okay,
where did they get those ideas of how we should do global financing movement of things?
Yeah.
That itself, a lot of these wealthy people aren't like economists. They're not Milton Friedman's or Hayek's or Keynesian. They get their concepts of wealth and money from these theorists, the people who think of the ideas now. And so if you're in a position of influence, as we see you have with wealthy people, whether it's Elon Musk in the case of right-wing stuff or George Soros and left-wing, those guys still have a theory of what they think they should do with their finances and all the rest of it.
Okay.
And I would argue that's come out of this philosophical tradition. So, and again, ultimately the universities are primary.
So the universities are part of convincing those people to fund them to do what they want to do.
Yes.
But what I'm asking is ultimately, who's the one person or the sort of behind the scenes that's making this all happen? I mean, what's the root, do you think?
Okay, so this might this might not be the kind of answer that our secular friends want to hear. But I'll just be very frank with you. We know exactly from Ephesians 6 verse 12. This is called principalities and powers.
Yeah.
We are 1 John 5:19. The world that we live in, for now, until Jesus' return, is under the power of Satan.
Yeah.
And these people are not going to like what I'm going to say here, but it's biblical, and I believe it, that ultimately most of these people and these organizations, whether they like it or not, whether they're atheists or not, are subject to these principalities and powers.
Yeah, they are actually pawns in their own right.
The problem for you and I, as men living in town, is we kind of fighting this in the trenches with our wives and our kids in the battle there.
And the public schools and the public universities.
Schools and the public schools. And we're told to contend for the faith in that arena.
Yeah.
We're also told to pray, because there is a higher spiritual battle going on in the heavenly realms.
Yeah.
Okay? There is a cosmic conflict going on here at this level.
Yes.
And we as Christians need to realize that that is true. But we're not to go and make forays into that realm there. We're told by that. We shouldn't get involved with divination and consulting and trying to summon up demons so I can find out where the next demon is so I can get into the cage with an MMA and pull a Dricus du Plessis on this demon. because there is that realm.
Yeah.
And so in some sense, we're told in the scriptures where to focus our efforts. We're told to speak truth in love, to take ideas captive, and to pray.
Yeah.
And when we see demonic stuff coming along, we in the name of Jesus, we say no. We don't want this here. We don't want this. I mean, let me give you an example where I think this really crystallizes. Think of the idea of women's liberation, okay, which is very popular amongst our feminists now, particularly if you go and read them, okay.
Yeah.
Their sacred cow, what the Trinity and the deity of Christ mean to me, their sacred cow is the woman's right to abort her own children.
Sure.
To think that a woman is liberated when she's been convinced to butcher the child within her own womb is somehow a great act of liberation. I just don't know how that comports. Nevertheless, they've been sold that. Now, if ever there's an idea, which I would say with full confidence is of the devil, it's having persuaded women, even in the case when a child has been conceived in rape, as unfortunate as the rape event is, if a child has been conceived, it's a human being.
Yeah.
And what are you doing to it, butchering it?
Yeah.
And if ever there's a devilish, demonic idea, it's having persuaded women that that's a good.
Yeah.
That it's okay to do that.
Once again, that it's health care.
Yeah. And to press the point even further, if that little child is a little girl and you a little girl, even more so, to press the argument.
What about that little girl's women liberal rights?
If you are so zealous for women and this happens to be a future woman, you have snuffed that child's life out.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
For what? The sake of convenience.
In many cases, that's the case. And so I think that this is, that idea is pretty demonic.
Yeah.
The idea that it's okay for young kids, for us to plow their bodies with these powerful drugs and then perform surgery on them.
Cutting off healthy body parts.
I rank that alongside the ideas of Joseph Mengele and what some of these monsters in the Nazis were doing to the Jewish people by cutting them up.
Yeah.
And Peter Singer, who's probably the most famous ethicist in the world, practical ethics, he makes his argument where he thinks he's got this great argument for justifying all of these bad ethical positions that everybody subscribes to nowadays. He says if his argument is sound, a person would be justified to taking the life of their child up to the age of 2 years. I mean, that's the justification of infanticide. And so, but these are the intellectual, hulle is die slim mense. Jy weet,
hulle moet weet van beter. They should know what they're talking about.
There's no ways that our intelligentsia at Wits University or Stellenbosch University or UCT would ever subscribe to these ideas, because they're far more responsible and they're noble, virtuous people. And I'm like, no, they're just people. They know a few things, and they can also be the holders of some really bad ideas. Yeah.
Through this whole conversation, I'm just blown away by the power of thoughts. If you think a certain way, and many of these things that we're talking about today, it started out with someone having an idea, writing it down, discussing it with others. It got momentum, and it eventually became, as you said, culture. It became the way of life. Isn't that amazing that thoughts are that powerful? And shouldn't that in itself be a wake-up call to every person to go, what am I actually thinking? Yeah. I should take my thoughts captive and judge them by the Bible, the biblical standard, and be very honest with myself.
Yep.
And if I think a certain way, just take a moment. Why do I think that?
Yes.
Why, if I'm a Christian, why do I think about, pick a topic, abortion, women's rights, a child's rights, or parents' rights? Any of those conversations, what do I really think about it, and why do I think that? I think that's because look at the power of thought.
Yeah, look, I mean, ideas have consequences, and we can see that massive consequences.
I mean, you study it for a living in a way, and you see the consequences of it. I mean, I remember you breaking down at Wilberforce Academy, talking about the kinds of issues that you see on campus, students coming to you, broken, because they took these thoughts, made it their way of living, and it's decimated their lives.
It's decimated their lives. Yeah. No, I've got so many stories of young people whose lives have they've been captivated by these ideas, and then they've lived those ideas out, and it has been a train wreck. And
how many parents have come to your house and cried over their student children?
Oh gosh, I've lost count of the number of parents who've cried on my shoulder about what's happened to their kids, and their lives have been shattered by these things that everybody thinks are so new and cool, and it's not new, and it's certainly not cool at all. And so you're right. Look, Heinz, that is a powerful point you're making there, is we as Christians need to very, very intentionally stop sometimes and think and say, what's going on here? The scriptures that commend us, watch your life and doctrine closely so that you might preserve yourself and others. Test everything, okay? We're told, we're commended to do this. Think about what is good and true. We're not Buddhists who just empty your mind. We should be thinking about virtue, about truth, goodness, and beauty. And we should recoil at a culture of narcissism and nihilism, which dominates and is part and parcel of this toxic cocktail that's been shoved down the culture's throat. We need to start thinking as Christians about this thing, and you're right, we need to have moments of reflection now, and the scripture calls us to do that, to test everything. Just because somebody gets up there and says something and they have some academic credentials doesn't mean that they're right. Okay?
And academic credentials in our nation seems to be, a god. Like if they have so many letters behind their name, they must be right.
Yes.
And actually, no. That's not the ultimate test.
No,
the ultimate test is not how many letters you have behind your name. It's what does the Word of God say in relation to what you're saying, and we have to be able to test it accordingly.
We need to test it, and this is the 2 Corinthians. And so remember, a true understanding of spiritual warfare, okay? And there's lots of stuff going on. I'm not suggesting that there isn't stranger aspects of the warfare and demonic things that are going on, and we need to pray against. It's all part of the same battle.
Yes.
Here's the danger.
I just think the enemy has different strategies for different spheres.
Yes. And I agree with you. So it's not that I'm not mindful of that, but on a battlefront, sometimes the things with which Christians are concerning themselves is the skirmish. And the main battle is right in front of you.
Wow.
And I said this when I was in America. I said to him, here you are focusing on a skirmish, and yet right behind you on your tablet you gave your son, he's watching pornography. Okay. So before you send us nice gifts, okay, to Africa to help us in our poverty, where our kids are protected from that thing that you put in your hand, think again.
Wow.
Be careful now. Exercise some discernment and wisdom now, because you somehow think that you're safe and you're guarded. And the levels of subversion and deception in our times are unbelievable. It's almost marvelous to see how we as a nation have been captivated, that this thing has imperialized over all of South Africa now, and this is the main thing, and everybody's so excited about this, and because it's all decolonization and we're getting back to our African roots, when it's anything but that.
It's the great deception.
It's the great deception of our time. It's like I said to you, it's the greatest lie in South Africa, that what's going on in our academic institutions is the returning of South Africans and South African culture back to their historical African roots. If anything, it's nothing to do with that. And it is the entrenchment of another European philosophy. And I've shown you half of the text on the table that demonstrate that to be the case.
And when the fruit of these things finally land, and there's a harvest of these toxic ideas, it's going to be too late. Everyone's going to go, oh, I didn't expect that to happen, or me to lose my completely lose my identity as an African or whatever. But now I have, because I've been called into this collective that's just an idea created by people with very dodgy thinking, and they were European thinking. And now it's the craziest thing. I mean, it's just, and you see it happen right in front of your eyes. And you're talking about there's a skirmish, but what's really going on made me think of this idea of, what is a good when you're a good what's a tovenaar, like a magician.
Yes.
It's bait and switch. I'm misdirecting. Misdirection actually is the right word. I'm showing you this while I'm planning this. And then I reveal it to you, and it's that thing. And it's such a good example about the father who is not cognizant of what his son is being exposed to at home, but he's like, I want to stand up for Africans who don't have food. That's a great example. I mean,
and then your son has been destroyed behind you. No, you're right. This is
and that's a great example of misdirection. And the Bible calls the enemy the great deceiver. He's the father of lies. And the thing about deception is you don't know when you are deceived.
Yes.
And that's where the power lies for the enemy.
Yeah.
So what you're talking about today is so powerful, because it makes us go, wow, I actually need to look at, am I deceived in any way?
Yep, we need to be honest that we might be not have these. And that's why we need a Christian community, so we can talk. And actually, that's why we need a society where we can practice freedom of speech.
Yes.
Because one of the greatest ways to push back is to simply start speaking the truth in love, and have the courage to do so, and not fall for this political correctness, which we ailed us for so many years, and then became most manifest in a social justice culture, where now we went from political correctness to hate speech, where people are actually fearful of saying and speaking about this. And now we've got diversity and inclusion, which basically is the biggest joke on the face of the planet, because where's the diversity in diversity? There is no diversity there. It's everybody come to the table and you all accept this ethic and nothing else.
Yes.
And in order to include some people, you need to abandon your own convictions. That's basically the sum total of this whole massive fraudulent thing that is going on in South Africa with our diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants. The whole thing is a massive project in hypocrisy. It's got nothing to do with inclusion. It has no regard for any other worldview. It has complete contempt for anything except itself. And if you don't agree with it, then you're the problem. And the dangerous thing about this, the most dangerous thing is we are a country who has got some serious historical issues to redress of pain and racism and hatred and bitterness. And it still continues. We still live in the post-apartheid hangover. Okay? Now, my fundamental problem with all of us is this entire system starts off at a foundational level by bifurcating people into two classes. It's the bourgeoisie proletariat distinction. It assumes at the beginning and at the outset that there's always some oppressor, and if you can't find him, be rest assured he's there somewhere. And so you keep digging until you find that person.
Because if I can be a victim, then I should get something.
That's what you want. And so I would like to ask these people, and I'd like to ask our universities, exactly how are we going to come through all this pain and bring real reconciliation on the back of this polarized, dialectical nonsense of Hegel?
Yeah, which
I'd like to know that.
Accusatory in its essence.
I'd like to know that.
Yeah, sure.
And there is no, if this becomes the sine qua non, the status quo of our leaders in our nation, in the judiciary level through critical race theory and others, and our politicians have these ideas, we are in for a very bleak future.
Wow.
And this is why, like, I'm going to say to every single Christian here out there, anybody in this country who calls himself a Christian and has a regard and a fear of God and loves the family, doesn't think that parents are the worst thing in the lives of the children and their oppressors, and doesn't think that some of these new sexual things are cool and progressive, that takes issue with these things. My call is to all of them is that to them, you need to start speaking up, having the courage to stand for your values.
Come on.
And next time you go to the voting station, okay? Next time you vote, okay? Don't be so worried about the pothole in the front of your house. Take a little concern for what your child might be taught in our institutions, okay? Because I would rather ride through that pothole than have my kids and your kids and all the Christian kids be turned into this mob of revolutionaries who are godless, who hate Christianity, who have contempt for the family, and that is
and who think their identity is rooted in their sexuality,
sex or what they do.
It's so hedonistic.
It's so self-centered and narcissistic.
Yeah.
And so this, in some sense, is a rebuke, and I don't mind saying it because I think it is. I think that the efforts on the part of the Christian community in our recent elections was sad, to say the least.
It was dismal.
We should vote according to values and principles.
Yeah.
We are people who believe in those things even when it isn't going well, because we're people who care about truth, not just about what's going to work for me tomorrow. Okay? Because many of the problems that are manifesting in our country are here in the Western Cape. We know about that. We know about the lawsuits here around the corner here at the local schools here, where these battles have come. And we know which party's in charge here. Okay? And you have to ask yourself, okay, what's going to happen now? Is this going to continue on now or something? And the Christian community in South Africa is large enough. If we all just voted according to principle to build a party that actually represents our values.
Come on.
Yeah. We want somebody who's going to represent my values and doesn't lie to me, okay, and say, well, we're going to stand for you. We appreciate your vote, but we're going to get all our universities to teach this stuff, which teaches that Christianity is the fundamental problem.
Yeah.
That's what we've got going on at our universities now.
And our tax money is going towards that to an extent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hectic.
Anyway, I didn't want that to become a political rant, but I suppose we could throw that in there as well. Yes.
Well, these are the realities. When we have a true spiritual conversation, it will go into every sphere of life. And, if people can accuse you of being political, but your focus is not being political as much as it is, we need answers and we need breakthrough and we need something to shift, because we're not heading in a healthy direction.
No, we're not.
I would like you to speak as well to the whole thing of family, husbands, fathers, children. If you can speak to the dads and the husbands out there that have, primary school, high school kids, even university children, some of them might be listening and going, oh, my word, I've messed up, or I've missed something, or I can't believe I sent my child to university, or they're like, my child is in a public school, how can I help them? How can I lead them? How can I guide them? What would your advice be to the men, the husbands, the fathers, in how to help your family navigate this world that we live in?
Well, and this is something I care very deeply about. I'm involved with a men's ministry called Camp David up in Potch, and we do conferences and weekend retreats to help restore biblical masculinity.
Awesome.
Remember, at the center of the abolition of family is the attack on one person, dad.
The man.
Yeah, the man. You are the problem. I mean, if you read Shulamith Firestone here, it's very clear that men are the problem. And interesting enough, it begins with biology. Like, what can you and I do about that? I mean, so we just got dealt a bad deck here on that front, according to. So you realize they're raging against reality. So
exactly.
What we want to try and do is first of all, I want to say to all of the Christian men who are in good families. I'm gonna use some old-fashioned languages. I'm gonna say, hey, catch a wake up, boys. It's time to catch a wake up now. Okay? Start changing the priorities in your life now. Stop with the nonsense now and the stuff, more stuff now. There are far bigger things of far more consequences than you just kind of having a good old comfortable life, and there needs to be some sacrifice coming in now.
Yeah.
You're going to need to start taking responsibility, as all good men should, for where we are now. And the first thing you got to do is, if you've been treating your wife like a moron, you need to go and repent and sort that out now.
Come on.
You need to grow up spiritually now. You need to actually go and read your Bible and become a man. We are full of a land of men without chests.
Sure.
As C.S. said, we're spineless. We need to be propped up in our pews because we lack courage.
Yeah.
We're intimidated by these philosophies. It needs to stop now. We need a moment of courage.
Come on.
And we need to start with those guys. And I can speak to the Christian men now. You know who you are out there.
Yeah.
Then you've got to ask yourself, suppose we need to be on our knees a lot, by the way, men. To your Bibles, to your knees. CT stud. We don't want no more chocolate soldiers here. Okay. This is a war.
Yeah.
This is not a war of bullets. This is a war of ideas. It's more difficult.
And the war is trying to take out your marriage. And it's trying to take out your children.
And take out you. It's accusing you of being this evil thing.
Yeah.
So we need to protect our marriages. But then here's the problem. If the biggest problem in our nation is fatherlessness and broken families, who's going to, number one, give them the example to follow, and who's going to be the family to the fatherlessness? Who's going to do that? You know what?
Question.
It's us.
Yeah.
It's the work of the church. Who's
going to stand up?
It's going to be it was the work of the Lord in the Old Testament. What does he say? Be mindful of the orphans and the widows.
Yeah.
You better take care of them. This is the business of God.
And it's repeated in the New Testament by James.
Exactly. And you know what? Part of Israel's judgment was not just because they got into burning their kids like the Canaanites did to Molech.
Brought them to Molech, yeah.
These were also part of the things that Israel was judged for. The condition of their marriages.
They were neglecting it.
They were neglecting the destitute, the sojourners, and everybody. That is our work. We have over 3 million orphans in this country. My only question is, who is going to adopt them? That is the work of Christians.
Amen.
It is our job to do that.
Isn't there a strong connection, what we're talking about, between a pagan way, in essence, these philosophies are taking us back to paganism. It's taking us back to the self, the flesh, sacrificing children, mutilating children, all these things. I see a strong link to that, and I think what we need to make sure as Christian men is that we do not fall in the trap of mixing our lives with pagan worship. Would you agree with that?
No, I agree with you, and unfortunately, some of the stuff has become really subtle. So
that's the thing.
It's not like, oh well, I don't go to the Satanic Church down the road. I said to them, but at least in that case, it might be obvious that you're in the wrong venue.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more subtle.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've really got to guard your heart now. You need to find a company, a band of brothers.
Amen.
With real accountability.
Come on.
Guys will look you in the face and you know what? Like the kind of buddies you appreciate.
Yeah.
Say, hey, stop your nonsense, man.
How's your marriage?
Yeah, I saw you talking to your wife like that. She might be wrong. You shouldn't talk to her like that.
Yeah. Come on.
She's a gift from God. You don't talk to I had guys who had the courage to tell me that. You watch yourself there.
Yeah. Give me your phone. Let me see your browser history.
Let's see what you're doing now.
Sure.
Let me see what you actually, in all the gifts that God has given you, whether you actually believe in stewardship or ownership.
Come on.
Yeah. What are you doing with because none of it belongs to you anyway.
Or do you live the way that it does belong to you?
You live the way that it. So we need to challenge the Christian men first, and we need to also be praying that God would cause a revival in amongst those Christian men. Then we've got to come together and form this thing called a church.
Yeah.
Because a church is really a compilation of families.
Yes.
And then we've got to reach out to the brokenness. Because who's going to be a father to the fatherless? You're going to be the father. I'm going to be the father. I've already got a young man in my life whose dad died in Potch Hospital. He's a Zimbabwean boy.
Wow.
I didn't get to choose that, but he's my son, whether I like it or not. It's the son the Lord gave me that didn't come from my wife, but he's there. He's in my life.
Wow.
And that's the reality. And so we need to take responsibility for these things, and we need to realize that our nation at a fundamental level doesn't need huge heroes. It needs dads. The best antidote to gangsters is fathers who say, not in my town.
Not on my watch.
You're not coming to my daughters. You're not going to sell your drugs here. And you're not going to do this here. And I'm not scared of your guns and your bullets and everything. And when you get a pile of fathers that are like that, that's the best way to deal with the stuff. It's much more. The police are just trying to control things. To change the culture is not the job of the SAP.
No.
It is the role and the responsibility of good men and good women who live and are fearful of God, and righteousness means something. It's not just a platitude.
Come on.
Okay? And we believe in things and in virtue and courage, real courage and patience and strength of character. We're not just living for ourselves on our stupid little phones, taking some, selfies of ourselves ad nauseum, brushing our teeth. I don't know, whatever kind of dumb thing people do now. We need to grow up.
Yeah.
And we need that kind of revival. And we need a whole army of courageous men who are not just living for their family. I'm saying to them, God is going to expect more of us.
Yes.
We need churches to become places where families, because that's going to be, where's the brokenness going to? They're going down to the local Department of Home Affairs when they're in their crises? No, they're not. They need a home, and that's a church. And you need healthy families there to be the moms and dads, to have the conversations with the young girls who got no moms. I mean, I'm so grateful, and I can share this with you. I'm so grateful. I've got girls and boys in my family. Yeah. I'm so grateful for my wife, because my girls have reached an age with a young woman. And I'm so grateful to the Lord that she could have the conversation about woman stuff with them.
Yeah.
And I can talk to my boys about dad stuff and boy stuff.
Yes.
I'm so grateful to the Lord.
Come on.
But my heart goes out to all the single parents. The dads who've had to have those conversations with their daughters, or the moms who are going to have conversations with young teenage boys about dad stuff and boy stuff. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so I think that we are going to have to be those people. And that's not going to be fixed by any kind of government program and all these kinds of things. It's going to be the work of the church. And it's not some lofty thing.
No.
Okay. It's more down to earth.
It's actually the most natural thing, because we were created for it.
We're created for it.
Yeah.
So the greatest way for us to all fight against this crazy ideology that has gripped the world and gripped our country is to go back and do family well.
Come on.
To love our wives well.
Beautiful.
To get on our knees and to pray, not just about what we need, about things beyond us. Okay? Yes, God is concerned with it. But let's start asking the Lord for prayers beyond your own situation. That's not legitimate to ask God to help you there.
Yeah.
But we need to have bigger prayers. We need to start finding opportunities where we can all kind of, as Michael Cassidy said, we can all do our bit.
Yeah.
You've got some skills. You've got some gifts. Where can you use them to help you? You're a very good businessman. You can help this now. You're very good with killing. We need good social workers. We need people we've got to find these gifts, and we need to start exercising them for the edification of the body, and also to reach out to our broken country.
Yes.
And above all things, and this is the most important thing, because I think the hour is, this can't continue on for a long time. The fundamental thing that needs to start, and I'm grateful for some South Africans that have been leading some of this now, and in that we need to start praying, like serious prayers. Like, this is what I've learned. I've spent 25 years of my life studying this stuff and reading this stuff and seeing what it does to people.
Sure.
And then the Lord said to me, that's one thing, but are you praying?
Yeah. What's the antidote?
And I'll be honest with you. I realized my prayer life was nothing.
Sure.
And He says, look, if you want me to come and for there to be a change in the hearts of men, you need to also ask. You can ask for it.
Yeah.
Because right now I'm living in the land of theorization.
Yeah. Sure.
And God is a God of power.
Come on.
And I'm looking for that. I'm looking for the Lord and the Holy Spirit to visit this country.
Come on.
Because we can do all these things, but this is a massive fight. I feel like I'm building a sandcastle on a beach at the stranger, and there's a tsunami coming.
Yeah.
Who can stand in front of this?
Feels impossible.
It feels impossible. All our institutions have been captured.
But what's impossible with man?
Yeah. So
is possible with God.
The last 2 or 3 years, I've been reading a lot on prayer, and I've been reading like Andrew Murray, and I've been so convicted. Oh gosh.
Sure.
It is so convicting. And I realized that it's one thing to know these things. That's important. We've got to do that. But we have to start having some really serious, when there are moments where we Christians are calling us to pray for our nation. And beyond you, me, myself, and I, you want to find those kinds of Christians, and you want to get together and you want to get real serious with the Lord. Because I think of 2 Chronicles 7, if a people who are called by my name.
Yes.
And I like to think I'm called by His name.
Amen.
Would turn and repent, which means I'm like Daniel. Daniel was a righteous man. I'm certainly not a Daniel's thing. I'm more like kind of, I'm just rotten. I'm more like, yeah. But look at Daniel. If ever there was a righteous man in Scripture, yet he saw himself in that sin as well.
Yeah.
And I want to repent from that on my own personal level. But I want to cry out and call out, as with many Christian brothers, and saying, Lord, hear our prayers. May we have not crossed the threshold with you, such that you said to me, I'm done with you now, South Africa. I'm done with you now. Sure. You are now going to go into a period now where I am going to bring you low. Because in the Old Testament, He did it with His own people, because they got to a position, they said the Lord would never come here, He would never do this and everything, and they were presumptuous. Yeah. Because their faith had become hypocrisy. Yeah. And the two things that the Lord has contempt for is pride, which is everywhere, and in His house, hypocrisy.
Sure.
Man, I pray that we aren't suffering from levels of hypocrisy, that the Lord has said to us, I'm done with you now. And now you're going to go into a period now where you're going to be brought under my justice and my judgment. Because He will do that. He will do that. And I'm praying, and I think many others are praying. I've got good friends of mine, people like Henry de la Harpe and John Matusley, and friends of mine, Arnu van Niekerk, and these guys that I've been working with, and others like yourself, and that we need to be serious about prayer. Michael Cassidy, particularly, if you go and look back at the work that they did and everything, they prayed for 24 hours before the 1994 elections. Wow. Because we were on the precipice of going into civil war. Yeah. Now we got a different kind of war going on here now. But we need to get really serious about a community of South African Christians that gets really serious about praying for our communities, our churches, and our nation. And that's the journey I'm on now with the Lord, just to continue to study this stuff, but to really grow in my prayer life with other brothers and say, look here, to your Bibles, lads, and to our knees. Yeah. We need to go there. And we need to call upon the Holy Spirit to visit this nation in a powerful way. Yeah. Amen. To reinvigorate people's hearts that have become like stone, and to wake them up from their slumbers of living for self and their narcissistic lifestyles, and to start realizing that we need to start living for the kingdom of Christ.
Come on. Wow. We need men turning to God and on their knees for their families and their communities, and we need them to do that consistently. That's the challenge. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, brother. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your heart. Thanks for your passion. It is. I mean, when I was thinking about the show, in a conversation, it came up that boldness is contagious. And so I know that your boldness is contagious in my life, and I hope it would be for many others as well.
Yeah.
And I'm so aware of the times we're living in and how important these conversations are. So thank you. Thank you for every sacrifice, every piece of book you had to read that, you must have struggled with, like you're reading lies and you're studying it to know it, but then also your knowledge of Jesus and the Word. And so thank you for that, and thank you for being here today. What would your final word be to me, to South Africa, to whoever's listening, as we close our conversation?
Awake, O sleeper.
Awake, O sleeper.
Rise, and Christ will shine on you.
Amen.
It's time to awake. We've got to wake up.
Yeah.
We need to wake up. We need to remind ourselves, next time you take communion, give some hard thoughts about that. Next time you're in a church now and you think of Christ, start thinking a bit deeper now. And then we need to act. I mean, this has all been said before. We love the slogans. Edmund Burke said this: the only thing it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to sit around and do nothing.
Come on.
Plato said this about apathy. He says the price of apathy in civil affairs is to be ruled by evil men. Even the pagans understood what happens when apathy grips you. I said to him, at the end of the day, in some sense, I'm responsible for the future I leave behind for my kids. I've got people getting excited now about abandoning South Africa to go to America. Now we see this
thinking it's going to be better.
Thinking it's going to be better, or that's not the option in my estimation for Christians. We go to where the problems are because we're with Christ. Now, I don't begrudge any person who decides to do that, and I want to make people clear. My family from Zimbabwe, so I've got all the medals you want. And not only were my family beaten up in farms and kicked off their farms in Zimbabwe, my uncle was murdered in KZN. So I've got all those ugly medals that people think, oh, who are you to say that? I don't say that lightly.
Sure.
I don't say that lightly. But I am a Christian, okay? And I know that this world is not all there is, and that there is a battle going on. And as Christians, okay, we are called by Christ, not to run from the darkness, but to displace it with light and truth. And that is no easy thing. And so if somebody chooses in the best interests of their family to move, that's fine. You're responsible for that. But for those of us who decide we're going to stay here, we're going to get on our knees, and we're going to call upon the Lord, and we're going to do our thing. We're going to do our bit. I'm calling out to you. That's here, and not because I've said it, because Christ has long since said this now. And the church has been through this before. We have many Christian communities who've stood up against this kind of stuff, and we need to take some lessons. We need to humble ourselves, and we need to get on with this now. And so for anybody who listens to this, I just want to encourage you to take courage. We need to stir each other up.
Be bold.
Be bold. Not forsake meeting together. Get out of your reclusive behavior. Stop living on your screen. Go next door to your friend and have a braai with them and talk about life and
get
dream.
real.
Get real. Speak to people face to face. We need to not forsake meeting together, and it's what it said, Hebrews 10:19-25. That's the verse I always have on the bottom of my email. It's my favorite verse in the Bible. Is stirring one another up to love and good deeds, not forsake meeting together somewhere in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as we see the day approaching. We need to do that.
We won't read the rest of Hebrews 10 right now because that's quite scary.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that.
No, thank you for your time.
Thank you for being here, and may God bless you, your family, marriage, your everything that's happening with Ratio Christi, and with your mission on that campus. May it be blessed. How can people support Ratio Christi and the work that you're doing?
We have a website, ratiochristi.co.za, and there's a number of ways that you can support us. Number one, we need prayer. That's the most important thing we need. Number two, you can commend us because we've got a lot of free resources on our website, articles, free ebooks. We have an associate YouTube channel where we've interviewed a lot of scholars on some of these contentious issues. So we try to produce good resources to tackle some of these pressing issues in our times.
That's awesome.
And so you can commend that to students, recommend us to students, but also our material is available to the local church. You can contact us on our website as well. We would love to do more events for churches. I've done stuff with you, for example.
Yeah.
And then last year in January, I did a worldview weekend here. We do worldview weekends. We do foundational weekends, training people on some of these issues. We've also started a thing dealing with contemporary we're trying to find a good term for it, because we're dealing with this anti-family, hypersexual culture now.
Yeah.
So we do conferences where we deal with these issues as well. And so we want to train and equip people. But our website is a way where you can do that. And then we can also receive any donations, financial donations and support. We are a student campus ministry, so we don't have a lot of money because students don't have money. But we're hoping that we can up our game on that front. And because what we want to do is we want to catch students and help them through their university days. But when they graduate now and you want to become a young doctor or a young lawyer or a businessman, that we can form cohorts of Christians who are involved in doing business or medicine from a Christian worldview and perspective.
That's great. So you don't have to go at it alone.
No. And so that's part of my association with the Wilberforce Academy, which is a great organization that's helping us. It's a natural follow-on from RC.
Yeah.
We're trying to rebuild the Christian Lawyers Association, which needs to be done. We need some good medical doctors trained by these good people that don't buy into this affirmative medical care.
Yeah.
We need a whole army of talented Christian educators. Imagine that.
Come on.
A whole army of well-trained, informed people in all the different disciplines who are Christians.
Amen.
Who love God, but they can read the stuff. They're great scientists and physicists and mathematicians and people in the arts and everything else. We need a whole generation of brilliant educators, businessmen as well, or ministry, pastors with big hearts but sharp minds. We need everybody's skills to come to it's the body of Christ.
Yeah.
This is old school Christianity. I'm not saying anything new here. You've all read the text. Come on now. We know. We've all heard the sermons 1,000 times.
Yeah.
We need to be that thing. The hands and the feet and the body and So I'm just,
Maybe you are doing this already, but I just had an idea that I want to throw out there. You know that when I went from high school to university, they had a first year's camp. And, sometimes if you need to go from one course to another, there's like a bridging course.
Yes.
Do you guys have, or would you consider having a bridging course for students? Because I'm a parent of a 15-year-old that, soon he's going to look at options.
Yes.
And there's a part of my father heart that goes, I don't want my boy to go to university, because they're going to teach him a whole bunch of nonsense. But is there a bridging course that Ratio Christi can host, perhaps, for kids going from high school to university to just prep them? Because, as you said, high schools don't offer this critical thinking, proper, biblical critical thinking. But is there something that you have, or would you consider doing that perhaps?
Well, it's interesting you raise that because we're actually on the cusp of kind of piloting a project now for high schools.
Come on.
Because so what we want to do is we want to challenge all schools with Christians and Christian students and Christian parents, but particularly, I think the ACSI, the Associated Christian Schools, there's like nearly 200 schools there. Okay. We want to say to them, look, when you hand your matriculant a matric certificate that now means they can go and study, and it doesn't matter whether they're going into if they do technical diploma, maybe they're going to become a tradesman, Soltech, or there's built a new institution in Potch there that's doing boilermakers and this kind of more trade orientated artisans. We need lots of those, and that's cool as well. But what we want to try and do is, when you hand them the matric certificate, we want you to hand them this thing that you're talking about, which is preparing you for life. Okay, because a lot of the time our schools, this stuff is difficult to navigate. I've spent a lot of time studying it, so we want to develop a curriculum to kind of prepare them for what's going to come, not just in the university but in the culture as well.
Yeah, in life. What are you going to be confronted with?
Yeah. So we are in the process of doing that. We're looking for one or two brave Christian schools to say, look, because somebody's always got to be the guinea pig.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you start most things, as you know, and you do things for the first time, somebody has to start out with, and it's always not as fine and as polished. But we want to pilot the program with a school.
All right.
And then once we can work with them and fine tune that, like with most things, we can fine tune and hone that into something that really works well for them.
Yeah.
We already do a worldview weekend with students on campus. We've done loads of those. We just did one this weekend with Stellenbosch students. This we've done many times, and we've got this thing well polished, and it has a huge impact on the students who attend.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So we want something like that for matriculants. In essence, it's going to be the same. We might just decide to add a few other extra classes in there, because we need to do a little bit more foundational work than we say, for example, would do with our university students. But
I think that's a great idea, and I would send my boys and my daughter eventually to that just to help them. But I think also as a parent, you challenge me to do my own research, do some own thinking, read your stuff from Rashu Christie, get my apologetics to a healthier place.
Yes.
And I want to encourage anyone listening to do the same. If for us as parents, we need to be more informed, and we need to apply our minds to the things. We can't just accept that everything will be okay, because in a way, if we just throw our kids to public schools and to universities, not, having a proper foundation at home, we're throwing them to the wolves, essentially.
For sure. So one of the things I'm doing at the end of this month, I'm doing a pastors fraternal in Joburg.
Okay.
So I've got a bunch of guys there who are no-nonsense kind of pastors in a tough part of Joburg.
Okay.
And they said to them, look, we're dealing with all this stuff all the time now. Can you come and help us? So I'm actually doing a foundation series with them, which is kind of the case for Christianity, an introduction to some of these concepts. Then we're going to do an apologetics thing, because they've got the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons and the Muslims, and they want answers to some of those questions.
Yes.
So we do like a mini apologetics conference for them and help them navigate those other worldviews. And then we're going to do a worldview weekend. So
that's powerful.
Yeah. So we're trying to find a strategy to reach our local communities. That's schools, fraternals, churches, church leadership, for example, would be important. And then also we want to reach out to the corporate world, because a lot of the corporate world now are having to deal with this diversity, equity, and inclusion thing.
Yes.
And they're not quite sure, well, what do I do with this
they
now?
feel forced to do it, but they know down deep this is not right. So.
Yeah, so what we want to do is we want to teach them real diversity, real inclusion. We live in a very diverse country. If you're going to be employing people and you don't know anything about their worldview, we can tell you about it.
Yeah.
And we can tell you, if you're going to employ people from different worldview backgrounds in your business, which inevitably is going to be happen, know something of it. It doesn't mean you have that worldview, but at least you're going to have some kind of
aware.
And that's real diversity, and that's real inclusion.
And that's actually loving, understanding where they come from, what they believe, so that they can better integrate. But ultimately, I don't know if you believe this, but I do believe there's a way to have the best person get the job, so that every sphere of life is actually effective and things work. And, and there's a healthy meritocracy, but not no form of discrimination unnecessarily. So I think that we can work to that place, right?
No, for sure. I do think that is possible, and I think that the corporate world is going to need to find an alternative to the existing stuff, which is just a Trojan horse. And you're inviting all kinds of misery into your institution if you allow these Marxists to come in there, because that's what they are.
And the fruit is obvious to anyone who's paying attention. But anyway, But I love that, and I think that's great, and I'm so glad you guys are already doing this. So, anyone listening should be supporting you guys, helping you guys, helping you to reach more young people, especially, and also with the education of parents and church leaders. I think that's awesome. So keep doing what you're doing. May God bless it, and may it just go further. And thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really, really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much. And I want to just pray and ask God that He would bless this new thing you've started here now, that this little arena here would become a place where
Amen.
people can speak the truth, and more Christian men and women can come in and share their ideas, and that this is fundamentally about making a difference in our families, in our local churches, and then in the country we all love so much.
Amen. Thank you.
Awesome.